In this section, we'll build this demo project where we'll work on a fictional food lover community where you can then browse meals and share meals with other community members. And whilst building this application, we'll explore the core NextJS concepts you must know no matter on which NextJS project you'll be working. We'll learn about routing and setting up pages and working with components and React concepts in general in NextJS applications. And we'll explore how NextJS simplifies the process of building full-stack applications and how it helps with data fetching and sending data back to a server. We'll also explore how to style NextJS applications, how to work with images in an efficient way. We'll also explore how to upload images, by the way, and how to set up page metadata. So, plenty of content in this section. It's a long section, therefore, hence, let's not waste any time and let's instead get started with those NextJS essentials. So let's finally get started with the NextJS essentials and let's explore that app router and all the core NextJS concepts you must know in depth in this section here. And for that, we first of all need a new Next project. Though I will say that attached to this lecture, you find a project on Code Sandbox in case you want to follow along there, so that you don't have to install anything locally on your system. And you also find a local starting project, so for a local project on your system attached to this lecture as well. Simply a default Next project, which I cleaned up a little bit and which we'll use as a starting project for this section. I did create this attached project with this npx create-next-app command, but then, as mentioned, I simply cleaned it up a bit. So here I opened up this edited starting project with Visual Studio Code, the code editor I personally prefer and I'll be using throughout this course. And in this project, I simply changed the content of the app folder, changed the content that's shown on the screen for that default page, added a different logo in the public folder, and overwrote the rules set up in this ESLint-rc JSON file. Other than that, it's the default starting project you would get when running that command that's shown on the Next.js website. And with that, you can then go into your terminal in that project. So open your default terminal or command prompt and navigate into this project. Or use the one integrated into Visual Studio Code, which is navigated into that project automatically. And make sure that you run npm install once to ensure that all dependencies are installed. On Code Sandbox, you don't need to do that. And thereafter run npm run dev to start the development server, which allows you to preview the application. On Code Sandbox, you also don't need to do that, since there the server is already up and running. Now with that, you then see the address, which you can visit to preview the project. And if you then go to that address, you should see something like this on the screen. And that's that very basic first starting project I prepared for you. And now we can take a closer look at that folder and how that all works. So we got this Next project, and how does this project now lead to this being visible on the screen? Well, to understand that, let's take a look at that app folder, because that is the most important folder in a modern Next.js project. It's this app folder where you set up your different pages that you want to have on your overall website. And that's why in there you also find a page.js file. Page.js is a reserved file name, just as layout.js and a couple of other file names you'll encounter throughout this section. And a file named page.js simply tells Next.js that it should render a page. However, if you take a look at that file, you see that in there, it's in the end a React component function that's stored in the file. Something you of course know as a React developer. The special thing about this component here just is that it's a so-called server component. A type of component that's not really easily built with just React, but that is embraced and supported by NextJS. Now on the surface, it's a regular component. There's nothing special about it, but NextJS ensures that this component is actually rendered on the server, that this component function is executed on the server. Hence, if you, for example, add a console log statement here, where you say executing, you will not see that here on the client side. If you open your developer tools and the JavaScript console, you can refresh as often as you want, you will not see that log statement here. Instead, you can see it on the backend. There, if you open the terminal where you started the development server, you see all these executing logs. And that proves that it's executing on the server because this process in the terminal is running the server. All the logs here are coming from the server side. So it's a regular React component, but treated in a special way by Next.js. It is treated as a server component and executed on the server. And it's then the returned JSX code that's sent over the wire to the browser to be rendered as HTML, so to say. And that's why we can see what we see here thanks to this component. So Next.js has these server components. Components that are rendered and converted to HTML, which is then sent to the browser. And as I mentioned, the file name here matters because it's that file name that tells Next.js that we want to have this as a page. But how could we now add a second page to this website? Let's say we also want to be able to reach a page localhost 3000/about. If that is what we want to do, we have to find some way of letting Next.js know about our intentions. Now, if we were using just React without Next.js, we could use React Router for that. But in Next.js projects, you don't do that. Instead, here, this app directory plays an important role. Because in this app directory, you can add new paths, which you want to handle as routes, by adding new folders. So if we want to support a /about route, we have to add an about folder. However, on its own, this folder won't do anything. If I just add this folder and I then go to /about, I get this default 404 page. And I'm getting this here because Next.js doesn't know about this about route yet. Adding a folder is not enough. Instead, you always also must add such a page.js file if you want to render a page, which kind of makes sense, I guess. So now we don't just have that root page.js file, which is responsible for the home page, the starting page, but we also have this nested page.js file in this about folder. And that will be responsible for rendering the content of the about route. So it's now in here where we can export a new component function that could be called about page, though this name does not matter. It can be anything you want. And then you have to return the JSX code that in the end should be rendered as page content. So here we could say about us. And then add more content if we wanted to, and we'll get to that Meals app soon enough, but for this demo and these basics, let's stick to this simple page. With that added and saved, if you now go to localhost 3000/about, you therefore now see about us on the screen. And here I'll now just wrap it into a main element for styling purposes. Like this. This ensures, due to the styles I set up, that this will be centered. So that is how we can add a new route, by adding a folder with a page.js file inside of it. Okay, now that we got this second page here, It would of course also be great if we could get to this page in any other way than manually updating the URL, because no one does that. It would be nice to have a link to that second page. And for that, on that starting page, we could add a new paragraph here, and then maybe add an anchor element where we say about us. And here the address then could be /about to go to that page. With that done, indeed we have that link here, and if I click it, I'm taken to this About Us page. But this approach now has a flaw. It's not ideal. And you can see that there is a flaw if you take a look at this refresh icon up here. As I click About Us, you will see that it briefly turns to a cross, which always is a sign that a brand new page was downloaded from the backend. So we left the current page and got a brand new page. The disadvantage with that is that we now no longer have a single page application, as we normally do when working with React. Now, of course, to some extent that makes sense, because I mentioned that with Next.js you would build full stack applications where the content is rendered on the backend, and therefore it makes sense that it's no longer happening in the front end, on the client side. But actually, the great thing about Next.js is that we get both. When we visit a page for the first time, by, for example, manually entering the URL, then indeed it's rendered on the server, we get the finished page, and we're here. But if we are on a page and we then navigate around by clicking links, for example, Next.js allows us to actually stay in a single page application and update the UI with help of client-side JavaScript code. Now, technically, the content of the next page will still be pre-rendered on the server, but it will then be updated on the client side with client-side JavaScript code, you could say. And therefore, you can get the best of both worlds. A highly interactive reactive client-side application once it's active, but a finished page being served if you're visiting the page for the first time, so if you did not navigate around on it yet. However, at the moment, we're not getting this benefit. With that link here, the page is always reloading, and we're not in that single page application. And the reason for that is that we're using the regular anchor element. That works, but it does get us out of that single page application. In order to stay in there, we have to use a special component called link, which we can import from next/link. This is a component provided by the Next.js framework, which you should use instead of the anchor element if you have some internal link, as we have it here. So if you have a link that leads to another page of your website. It then still takes the ref prop, and you could still also add other props like class name and so on. But now it is a component that will actually ensure that we stay in that single page application. So with that link component being used here, if you now take a look at that refresh icon, as I click this link, you see it never changes to a cross. It always stays the same, which proves that we're not leaving the page, we're not loading a brand new page. Instead, behind the scenes, the content of the next page will still be rendered on the server, but it'll then be sent to the client, and there it'll be handled by client-side JavaScript code to update what we see on the screen. Now, if you take a look at that starting project I prepared for you, you'll not just see that page.js file. Instead, there also is a layout.js file. And that's actually another reserved file name, another special type of file. Where the page.js file defines the content of a page, the layout.js file defines the shell around one or more pages. It's the, as the name implies, layout into which a page will be rendered. And every Next project needs at least one root layout.js file, so one layout.js file at the top of the app folder. You can also have nested layout.js files, So we could add one here in the About folder. And then this layout defined here would only apply to the pages in the About folder and any nested folders there. But you need at least one root layout.js file. And as you can tell in that file, we're also exporting a React component, just as we did it in that page file. This component then uses the standard children prop, which in React can be used by every component, to inject some content between the body tags. And that's also interesting. This component actually renders an HTML and a body tag. So some elements which you don't normally use in your React components. But you actually need to do that in your next project in the root layout to set up the general HTML skeleton of the website. Now you might wonder where the head element is, which is also typically needed to set a title and some metadata, and that's actually not rendered here because that can be populated in a different way in Next.js by exporting a special variable called metadata, a constant or variable. So this is also a reserved name. The component name was not reserved, but this here is a reserved name. And if you export a variable or constant with that name, it should contain an object where you can then set the title of the page and the description of the page and also some other metadata fields, which will then be applied to all pages that are covered by that layout. So that's why we don't have the head section here, simply because all the content that goes into head is set with that metadata or automatically behind the scenes by Next.js. But what's now this children thing here, which is being output here? Well, that will simply be the content of the page that's currently active. Because again, the layout is a wrapper around one or more pages, and depending on which path you are, children will then simply be the content of the page.js file that's currently active. So layout.js and page.js work together. Layout is the wrapper, page is the actual content. The content that will be injected here. Now there also are two other files in that app directory which I haven't covered yet, and one is the globals CSS file. Now in there I set up some CSS styles for you, and this file is being imported into the layout.js file so that it's essentially available on every page that's being loaded. This is how you can import CSS files in Next.js. It's an approach that also works in most vanilla React projects, and this will then simply ensure that these styles are made available on every loaded page. Besides that, we also have an icon PNG file here, and that's another special file name actually. If you add an image called icon, it will be used as a favicon by Next.js. Because you might have noticed that in the layout.js file, we did not set up anything regarding a favicon. So that little icon that shows up in the tab here, for example, and yet we have one here if you take a close look. And that's the case because I added this icon PNG file, which uses this special icon name. And if you add an image called icon directly in the app folder, as I'm doing it here, this will be used as a favicon. So as you can tell by now, the app folder is very important. In there, you define your routes by adding folders, and you have some reserved file names like page.js, icon.png, or layout.js, which then simply unlock different features, you could say. And for example, a route layout is needed just as you need page.js files to really set up a route. But you're not limited to these special files in Next.js. We can, for example, still also add regular React components, which are not treated as pages. For that, let's say that we want to put this image and this header into a separate component, so that we cut it from here and we instead add it to a component. We could do that by adding a new JavaScript file anywhere in that project, for example, next to the page.js file, and we could name it header.js. By the way, you can also use JSX as an extension, also for those pages, if you prefer that, but here I'll stick to the default, which was JS in this next project. But now I added this file here. You could also name this header with an uppercase starting character, but here, since all these other default and important Next.js file names use lowercase names, I'll stick to a lowercase name for my component file here as well. But now in here, we can export a function, a component function called header, where we return a fragment, and then in there this image next to the h1 element. So that's now again a standard React component. But now it's actually a component that's not automatically picked up or handled by Next.js in any way. It's not rendered as a layout or as a page. Instead, it's currently ignored, because header is now not some special file name. We can, of course, import it now. We can import it here into page.js, like this. And then here we can output it, just as you learned it with vanilla React. Because we are still working with React here. We are still working with components and JSX, just enhanced with some extra features. With that, if you save that and you reload, you see the same content as before, but now with that custom component being used. And you could really store this component anywhere. We could also add a components folder here inside of the app folder and move header.js in there. In that case, we just have to update the import and make sure that we import header from ./components/header. But with that being done, everything still works. Here you also see the importance of page.js. Because now that I added this components folder here, you could think that we now should be able to visit /components. But we would get a 404 error because this file in there is ignored by Next.js when it comes to routing, and we simply got no page.js file in here. So that's how the Next app router works. Now, personally, I prefer to store my components outside of that app folder, but you can absolutely store them in there. And indeed, in the official Next.js documentation, you can find an entire article that discusses different ways of structuring your Next.js projects and storing components. Attached to this lecture, you find a link to this article, and you can simply pick the structure you personally like the most. I prefer to have my components outside of the app folder so that the app folder is just used for routing and routing related tasks. Now, with that components folder moved out of header.js, you of course also again must update your import here. And here you can take advantage of another feature that's typically unlocked in Next.js projects, where you can use an @ symbol in your import paths to refer to the root project. So the root project outside of the app folder. It's this JS config file that configures this alias, and that's simply a little convenience feature which can simplify your import paths. Because now I can simply refer to the root project folder with @, and then there dive into the components folder and target the header.js file. That's how we can use this feature. And with all that, again, we got the same content as before if we visit the starting page, but now with that outsourced components folder. So now that we have a solid understanding of how we can generally set up routes and also work with regular components, before we dive into that meals app, there's just one other route type I also want to explore together with you. Because let's say we also want to have a blog route in here. So of course we could add a blog folder in the app directory and add a page.js file in there. But let's then say we also want to have different blog posts. So that nested in that blog folder, we have a post 1 folder, a post 2 folder, and so on. And of course this then doesn't lead anywhere, because this would mean that we need to add a new folder whenever a new blog post is added to the database or wherever we're storing them. And that is not scalable and not maintainable. So what we need here for these posts is a so-called dynamic route. A route which we only define once, but which is then capable of rendering different pages for different blog posts. And in Next.js, we can create such a dynamic route by adding a nested folder where we use square brackets. This is a special syntax supported by Next.js, where you then put any placeholder, any identifier of your choice between those square brackets. For example, slug or whatever you want. And this placeholder will become important later. Then we again need a page.js file because, of course, we want to render some content. And if you want to build a new page that should be visitable, you need a page.js file. Now let's start with the page.js file directly in the blog folder though. There we could of course export a component called blog page, where we then return this main element maybe and say the blog. And then here I want to have, let's say, 2 paragraphs with links to different blog posts. So I'll use that link component and import that from next/link. And then here, let's say, we want to have one blog post under blog/post-1, like this. But then we also want to have a second one that leads to post 2 here in that path. So almost the same path, but different segments here at the end. Now we need to go to that page.js file in that slug folder, in that square bracket slug folder. And here, of course, we also should export a component function. The blog post page, for example. And there we can again return the main element and say blog posts. And we'll make this more dynamic later. With that, if we save everything and you go back, you will see that if you visit /blog, you have these 2 links, and if you click them, indeed you're taken to that blog post page. And that works for both links. And as you can tell, if you take a look at this URL, it changes. We have post-2 here as a segment after /blog and post-1 for that other link. But it's the same page.js file becoming active for different segment values, so for different path segment values. And that is what is achieved with that dynamic route syntax here. This square bracket thing here simply tells Next.js that we want to have some path segment after blog in this case, but that we don't know the exact value of the segment yet. And it's then this placeholder, this identifier, slug, that will give us access to the concrete value that we do get when that route is loaded. Because Next.js actually passes a props object to all those page components. And all these page components get one special prop, which you can pull out with help of destructuring. And that's a params prop, which again is set by Next.js. You don't have to pass it manually because you're not rendering these components manually. Instead, Next.js is doing that for you, and it is setting this prop for you. And what's inside of this params prop? Well, this will be an object where every placeholder you had in such a dynamic route here will be a key, and the value stored under that key will be the concrete value encoded in the URL. So post-1, for example. And you can see that if you output it by accessing params.slug here, in this case, in this page here. If you do that, you see post1 here. If I enter anything -else here, you see anything -else here. And this is a great feature because this would now allow you to, for example, reach out to a database where your blog posts might be stored and fetch the blog post with that slug. so that you can then show its content on this page instead. And that's how you can set up such dynamic routes. Now, Next.js has way more to offer. You can also set up custom not found pages, deal with errors, add more pages, fetch data, change data, and we'll do all that, but not in this demo project, instead by working on that Meals app I showed you before. So I'm now in a brand new project, which you find attached both as a local and a Code Sandbox version. And this is this Foodies app, this Meals app project on which we're going to work for the rest of this section. Now, of course, the project we got here is pretty similar to what we have before, but I removed all those pages we created. We got an extra assets folder with some images that we need for this application we're building, so that's important. In addition, the public folder also contains some images that will be used. And I also, of course, have updated styles, an updated favicon, and then also an updated layout and page.js file. And especially the layout.js file is also interesting because it's not an empty shell as we had it before. Instead, we have a layout here where we still set up that general HTML skeleton, but you then also find an SVG graphic in there, which is simply there for aesthetic reasons and which will be rendered behind the header of this website in the end. So that's the project I prepared. Again, as mentioned, you find it attached, and that's the project we'll work on now. And here I now got a little exercise for you. Because we did already learn how we can generally set up routes in Next.js applications. We learned that over the last couple of lectures. And therefore, my exercise for you is to create 3 new routes in this new project that I shared with you. To be precise, I want you to create a meals route, a /meals/share route, so a nested route in the meals route with an extra path of share, and a community route. And for this exercise, it's then enough if every route renders a super simple React component that maybe just outputs some title. So the page content of all these routes is not important right now. We'll work on that together over the next lectures. But you should set up those routes, and if you feel like it, you also can add some links to some of these pages so that users can navigate between those routes. But that's not all. I then also want you to create an extra 4th route, which also leads to /meals/something, but now that something part should be dynamic. So that in the end, later, we'll have /meals/share, which will be the page that allows us to share meals with the community, and /meals/ and then some dynamic segment, some dynamic slug that will identify a specific meal and that will later allow us to view the details of a selected meal. That's my exercise for you. Create those routes, add some links, but don't worry about styling or the page content. In the next lecture, we're going to set up those routes together, and thereafter, we're going to fill them with some life. So, did you succeed? Let's now create those routes together. And I will start with the meals route. Now for that, we should go to that app folder, because that folder has a special role in Next.js projects, as you learned. And in there, we can set up a new route and a new path segment that can be entered in the URL by simply adding a folder with that intended path segment as a name. So for example, meals, if we want to be able to go to our domain /meals. Now, as I also mentioned before, adding just a folder like this won't do anything though. Instead, you must add a page.js file here to show something on the screen. And then in this page.js file, you should export a component, a React component, a functional component to be precise, In this case, you could name it meals page, though this name here, as I mentioned, doesn't matter. It's totally up to you. But you must export a component. That's important. And then here I'll simply return an h1 element where I say meals page. That's of course just some dummy content, and we're going to replace it with more meaningful content later. But with that added, we got the first route. Now the goal also was to add a nested route in that meals folder, so that we can also visit /meals/share. And for that, we can simply create a nested folder with, again, that path segment that we want to have as a folder name. And again, we need a page.js file in there in order to be able to visit that. And then, of course, export a component function. So here, the share meal page. That sounds like a fitting name. And then I'll return an h1 element where I say share meal. Now with that, we got 2 of those 3 routes you should add, but there also is another route, not nested into the meals folder, but instead a sibling to the meals folder. And that is the community route. And again, in here we add a page.js file and then export our community page component here. And then simply return h1 community. Now with that, we got those 3 routes set up, but I also told you to add some links that allow users to navigate between those routes. And therefore, that's exactly what I'll do here. And I'll start on the home page actually. There, below this h1 element, I'll add a paragraph that should display a link to the meals page. And for that, as you learned, you should use the link component provided by NextJS. This is a component that renders an anchor element, but that also allows NextJS to gain control of the ongoing navigation and keep you in that single page application. So here, if I want a link that takes me to the meals page, we can use the link component and then simply set the href attribute or the href prop to /meals. And of course, now we can also add extra links now. For example, one that leads to /meals/share, like this. And then I'll add one last link that takes me to the community page by pointing at /community. And of course, these paths, which I'm setting up here, do map to the paths I set up in my folder structure. So /meals goes to this page, meals share goes to this page or this folder, and community goes to this folder. And then, of course, the respective page.js files become active. So that's how that works. And if we now save that, and you then make sure that the development server is up and running, which is the case on Code Sandbox, but which you have to start manually locally. By the way, locally, in order to start it, you also have to run npm install first. And then you should be able to start it. And if you make sure that that's the case, you can visit localhost 3000 or whichever address is showing up for you here when you start that development server. And you should be able to see that starting page. Now, those links here are a bit hard to read. This is, of course, not the final styling. We'll make this app look better throughout this section, but we have these links at least, and we can click them. And if I click the meals link, I'm taken to the meals page, so that works. If I click the share meal link, I'm taken to /meals/share, and that also works. And if I click the community link, I'm unsurprisingly taken to /community and that community page. And with that, we added these 3 routes. Now there also was another task to also create a dynamic route that allows users to go to /meals/some dynamic segment, some identifier of the meal a user wants to view. And you also learned how that can be done. For that, back in that app folder, back in that meals folder, since that page that should be added is nested inside the meals path, it's /meals/some dynamic element. And therefore, inside of that meals folder, we add another subfolder, which is a sibling to the share folder. And we turn that into a dynamic route here by adding square brackets to the folder name. And then between those square brackets, as you learned, you put any identifier of your choice. For example, meal slug. But again, this is up to you. With that added though, you can then add your page.js file. And now this page here will become active whenever the user enters the address /meals/something, which is not shared though. Because Next.js is smart enough to understand that if you're visiting /meals/share, that it's this page that should become active. And not this dynamic page. Even though theoretically share could be treated as a value for this dynamic segment. But Next.js is smart enough to see and understand that there is a more specifically named folder, which therefore has precedence over this dynamic segment. But anything but share, like something or ABC or my-meal, will be treated as a value for this dynamic segment and will lead to the activation of this page.js file. And therefore with that, here we can export another component function, which could be named meal details page, where I want to output the title here where I say meal details, like this. And with that done, if we now save this, we can also visit /meals/abc or /something. However, as mentioned, if we visit /meals/share, we go to that share meal page. So that works as intended. And that's then this exercise solved. With that, we repeated what we learned, and you got more practice with this file-based router that's provided by Next.js. And we're therefore now ready to finally start working on the contents of those pages and on making this website more useful and beautiful. So let's now start working on this page and let's start making it look better and make it more useful. And for that, I actually want to start by adding a proper header and navigation and logo to this website. And for that, I'll actually work on that layout.js file. Because the idea behind layouts in Next.js is that they act as wrappers around pages. And you can theoretically also have nested layouts where a subset of pages could also use another more specialized layout. So you're not limited to this one root layout, which we have here in this project. It's worth noting though that if you had a nested layout, so if we had a layout in this meals folder here, then this layout here would indeed only become active for those meals related pages, but it would itself be nested into the root layout. So the root layout will always be active. And I can quickly show this to you by adding a component function to this layout.js file, because layouts, like pages, are in the end React components. And I'll name this meals layout. And then here I'll return, let's say, a fragment where I'll simply add a paragraph which says meals layout, and which below that paragraph should then output the actual page content. And for that, those layout components can use the special children prop that exists in React. Now you learned that every component can accept and use this prop, and that normally the content that's made available through that prop here will be the content wrapped by those component tags. So if I were using meals layout like this, then this content here between those tags is what would be made available through that children prop. However, in case of layouts and pages, we aren't rendering those components ourselves. We're not using them in JSX code ourselves, instead Next.js is using them for us. But Next.js will essentially wrap that layout around all pages or nested layouts that are covered by this layout. And therefore children will give you access to any nested layouts or pages. And hence we can output the page content here with children. And that's also what happens in that root layout, which, as mentioned, will still be active even if you have a nested layout. Now, this root layout also accepts this children prop and uses it to output the wrapped content, which again are pages or other layouts, nested layouts like this meals layout. That's how that works. And with that nested layout added, you'll see that on the starting page, we don't see it. We don't see that text meals layout anywhere on the screen on the starting page. But if I go to a meals page, we see it here. And yet the root layout is still active, as you can, for example, tell by this SVG, this brownish SVG, which is still visible here. So that's how layouts work, but here we actually don't need that nested layout, hence I'll delete it. But we will now work on that root layout to add some header that's visible on all pages. Some header that allows us to navigate between those pages. Now, to add that header, I'll add a brand new component. We could, of course, also just add it in here in this layout file, but in order to keep this a bit leaner, I'll add a separate component. And I'll actually also outsource this div here into a separate component thereafter. And therefore, I'll add a new file which should store that component. And we could name it main-header.js. Now, as I also mentioned before, it is up to you where you store those component files. If they don't have any reserved name like page or layout, NextJS doesn't care. You can add them like this or inside of a components folder, in the app folder, wherever you want. But I personally prefer to keep them out of the app folder so that the app folder is really only dealing with routing and not with those other components, but that's just a personal preference. There is this entire article in the NextJS documentation that discusses different ways of structuring Next projects. Now here, I'll keep it out of the app folder though, and therefore it's now in this main header.js file where I want to set up this header that should be shared across all pages. And for that in here, I'll export another React component, which I'll name main header, a regular React component as you know and love it. And then there I'll return a header element like this. And in that header, I then want to have a logo and the main navigation of this page. Now that logo should be clickable, and therefore I'll start by adding a link here, using the link component provided by NextJS, so that we can wrap that around the logo to make it clickable. And the idea is that clicking the logo simply takes us back to the starting page, so to this path here. But then the logo should actually be the combination of an image and some text. And therefore we can use that image element, that default image element, and then set the source to a certain image. And I want to set it to an image which I provided as part of the starting project. There I provided this assets folder to you, and that assets folder then has a logo PNG file, which is that logo I want to use. Now the great thing in NextJS projects, like in most React projects, is that you can simply import such an image into your JavaScript files and you'll then automatically get a path to those images. So here I'll import my logo image from, and then I'll use this alias here to refer to the root directory of my project, this @ symbol, and I'll therefore import that logo from @assets and then there the logo.png file. And that's then the source of this image, though what's important in Next projects, unlike in many other React projects, is that you can't just assign it like this. Instead, you have to access the src property, because this imported logo in Next projects will be an object where the path to the image is then stored under that src property. With that, I'll also assign an alt text A plate with food on it sounds fitting for this logo. And that's my image. Now I also want to have some text next to that image, and here the name of this demo app is simply Next Level Food. So that's now my logo. And we could outsource this into a separate component as well, if we wanted to, but here I'll keep it in this main header component. Now that's not everything though. Instead, I also want to have my navigation here. Hence, I'll add a nav element, and in there an unordered list, and in there a list item. And that list item should then contain another link leading to a certain page. To be precise, a link that allows us to browse the meals that have been shared by community members. So here it should lead to /meals. Now that's not the only link though. Instead, I'll also add another link which should allow us to go to the community, to the foodies community, and hence here it should lead to /community, like that. That's my navigation. With that all added, and with this main header component finished, we can go back to that root layout, and then there, output this main header above that children slot here. So above the page content. Simply like this, though very important, you of course must import it. So here I added this import from that components folder in the root project directory. If you do that and you save everything, you should see something like this if you revisit the page. A total mess, but at least the header is there. It's there and it's working. And it's there on every page, which is amazing. And we can also go back to the starting page. But of course, it's totally unstyled and doesn't look good. And that's therefore what will change next. So let's work on styling this header. And when it comes to styling Next.js projects, you got a couple of different options, as it's the case for React projects as well. Now you can already see one option in this project here, and that is such a global CSS file as I have it here. And you could add multiple global CSS files. The names are up to you. They are global because they're getting imported like this in the layout.js file, in the root layout.js file. And therefore, any CSS file that's being imported like this into this root layout.js file will be available on every page, and the styles setup here will be available on every page. That's the great thing. But this is not the only way of styling Next.js projects. Another popular option for styling Next.js projects is to use Tailwind CSS, because Tailwind in general is pretty popular. It's a CSS library that allows you to style elements by adding small utility classes to those elements. And indeed, on the Tailwind website, you also find instructions on how you could add Tailwind to a Next.js project. And in addition, when creating a new Next.js project, you're also asked whether you want to add Tailwind CSS. At least at the point of time where I recorded this. So getting started with Tailwind in Next projects is pretty easy, and Tailwind, as mentioned, indeed is also a popular solution for styling those apps. But we're not going to use it in this project, simply because I don't want to bore you by adding a bunch of CSS classes to my JSX code. And that is what we would have to do when using Tailwind. So it's amazing, but not great for a course like this, where I want to focus on the main topic, which is Next.js and React, not Tailwind. Therefore, I'll not use it here, but you could use it. Instead, here in this section, we'll use another solution that's supported by Next.js. And that would be CSS modules, which is, in general, standard CSS code, but scoped to specific components by assigning special names to your CSS files. And that's supported by Next.js out of the box. And the idea simply is that you add CSS files that end with .module.css, And you can then import an object from those files, which will be generated automatically by the underlying build process and development server, which gives you access to all the CSS classes defined in those files as properties. And that's what I'll do here. And therefore, I prepared a CSS file for you, a main header CSS file, which you can add next to that main header JS file. And in that main header CSS file, I'm simply setting up a bunch of CSS classes and styles. You can, of course, tweak them as you want, but it should also work like this. Now we just have to import them, or import this file into this main header.js file to activate it and to make those classes available in this file and scope those classes to this component. And for that, we need a special way of importing this, not as we imported CSS in the layout.js file like this. That would simply add the CSS classes as global classes that affect all pages and all components. But instead, by using import and then any name of your choice, like classes, from, and then main header module CSS in this case, a relative path to that file. And with that added, you can now use this classes object, which it is, to access certain properties. And every class defined here in this main header module CSS file will simply be available as a property on this imported object. So for example, here on this logo, we can assign a class to this link. And we now don't do this as a string, like some class, but instead as a dynamic value where we access this class's object. And then here it's the logo class. And this will apply this class here and all the other related styles to this link and the nested elements. But it's doing that such that the styles are scoped to this component and can't affect any other component on the page, even if you would use a similar class name there. So that's the first step here. In addition, I also want to add a class name to the header itself, and that would be classes.header. And then on the navigation, I want to add a class to this nav element here with classes.nav. With all that done, if you save that and you go back to your page, this now looks much better. Now we got a properly styled header, a properly styled logo, and these navigation links here, which also look better, and which of course also still work. But now, all styled in a beautiful way with help of CSS modules. So now that we styled this header, there's another element of this header that can be improved, and that would be this image here. Because at the moment, we're simply using the regular image element for displaying this image. And that's not bad or a problem, but in NextJS, you actually got a better element for outputting images than this default image element. Because in NextJS, you have a special built-in image component which exists to help you output images in a more optimized way. For example, by lazy loading images under the hood, so that they're only displayed if they're really visible on the page. It does that automatically for you without any extra configuration. It can also simplify the process of setting up responsive images and so on. And therefore the recommendation is to use this image component in your Next.js projects if you are outputting any image. Now this image component has a lot of props and configuration options, and attached you find a link to the full article on this component, though I will say that many of those props and options are really for more advanced use cases. In general, getting started with that image component and using it in most use cases is pretty simple and straightforward. And all you have to do here in this main header component is to replace the default img element here with the image element that can be imported from next/image. Then you need to set the source to such an imported image, but now to that overall object and not just the src property value. So I changed that src prop value therefore. Because this object that's generated by NextJS when you import an image like this contains useful information that's used under the hood by this image component to display it in an optimized way. For example, it automatically detects the size of this image. And therefore, in its simplest form, this is all we have to do. No other setup is required. With that, if you reload, you see the image as before, but if you now inspect it, you will see that this image element that's being rendered here has a couple of extra attributes which we didn't add. For example, this loading lazy attribute, which makes sure that the image is lazy loaded and therefore only loaded if it's really visible. In addition, it automatically inferred the width and height, though we could override that if we wanted to. And it generated this source set attribute here, hence ensuring that differently sized images are loaded depending on the viewport and the device we are using to visit this website. In addition, it will also automatically serve that image in the best file format for the browser that's being used by a user. So, for example, as a WebP image if you're visiting this page with Chrome. As you can see, if you visit the Network tab and reload, there you'll see that this image that's being served here was returned as a WebP image, which is a special file format that is more efficient than a PNG. And you get all of that out of the box when using this image component. Now, one thing we should do here, about which we also learn here in the console, the JavaScript console, is add the priority property to this image, since it will always be visible when this page loads. So lazy loading doesn't make a lot of sense here, and we want to tell NextJS and the browser that this image should always be loaded as quickly as possible to make sure that we got no unnecessary content shift or flickering when the page loads. Therefore, on this image component, I'll now also add the priority property like this to make sure that this is loaded with priority. With that added, if we save that and reload, the page still looks as before, but this warning went away. And that is how we can use this image component. Now, as mentioned, you can definitely dive in deeper to explore all the different use cases of this component and all the different configuration options. For example, also if you're loading images from a third-party website or anything like this. Here for this website, this is all we have to do. Now, I mentioned that I also wanted to outsource this header background here into a separate component, and that's what I'll do next. For that, in that components folder, I'll add my main header background JS file, and in there export a component that's named main header background, like this. And now I'll simply grab this div here from the root layout and return that here in that main header background component. As a little bonus, we can now also extract that CSS class, which is set up in that global CSS file, and put it into a CSS modules file so that we practice working with that again as well. So I'll add another file next to this main header background JS file, and I'll name it main header background.module.css. And now we should grab this header background class and this SVG selector here from the globals CSS file and cut it from there. And instead add it here to this main header background module CSS file. You should now also tweak that SVG selector and actually select SVGs inside of an element with header background as a class. Otherwise, this won't work with CSS modules. With that done, back in the main header background component file, we should import classes from /main header background module CSS like this, and replace this here, this class name, with classes, and then the class name here is header-background. Now that's an invalid JavaScript property name if used like this, and therefore I'll use that square bracket notation and access the property value like this. With that we can save this and go back to layout.js, and then also output the main header background here. Or, since it, as the name suggests, belongs to the main header, we can actually not do that and get rid of the import and the usage in the root layout.js file and instead use it here in main header.js. There we could return a fragment so that we can add a sibling element next to the header, and that sibling is now that main header background, which I guess makes a lot of sense if we look at it like this. And with that, if we save everything, we got the same result as before, but now using another extra component, which you of course don't have to do, but which I did want to add here for practice purposes. Now I also want to group all these main header related files together into a separate subfolder inside of components so that we keep that components folder manageable and easy to navigate. And hence I'll add a main-header folder in that components folder and move all these main header related files into that main header subfolder inside of that components folder. With that, you then just have to make sure that in the root layout.js file, this import path here is updated, which in my case, my IDE did for me. And with that, the page still works as before. Now that we finished the header, let's continue working on this main page content, on this starting page content. And that means that we need to work on this page.js file inside of the app folder. So not any nested page.js file, but this main root page.js file directly in the app folder. Because that is that starting page we're seeing. That's the page that's being rendered if we visit our address /nothing. So if we have no segment thereafter. And here on this page, I actually don't want to have the content we currently have there. Instead, my goal is to have some header here. So not the main navigation header, but some nested page specific header that introduces users to this page, you could say. And then below that, the main section of this page. Now, since sibling JSX content is not allowed like this, we have to wrap that into a fragment in order to make this work. I also prepared some styles which we can use here, and therefore attached you find a page.module.css file. And yes, you can use CSS modules on pages as well, because in the end that's also just a regular component file, just treated in a special way by NextJS. But with that we can import our classes from this page.module CSS file, and then add a class to this header, for example. To be precise, add the header class here. Now in that header, I then later want to have a div, which should receive a class of slideshow, because here we'll soon have an image slideshow or a couple of images that change automatically that simply show different food images. So that's one thing. In addition here, I'll add another div below that other div here, which contains two more divs, where the first inner div here will receive a class name of hero, and that second div inside of a div will receive a class name of CTA for call to action. Now in that hero div here, I want to have my h1 title, where I'll say next level food for next level foodies, or any other catchy phrase of your choice. And below that, a paragraph where we could say taste and share food from all over the world. So this is simply some marketing text here. In that CTA area, I then want to have two links that allow us to go to different places, and I'm still importing that link component, so we don't have to change anything there. The first link should say join the community, and therefore it should point to that community page with /community. And the second link should point to the meals page and say explore meals, like this. And that's now my header on this page. We'll work on that slideshow later. Now in that main area here, in that main section, I just want to have some dummy text, which I prepared for you. Attached you find my page.js file, which is the same file you see here, just also with some extra sections added into this main block here. And you can simply copy and paste those sections into your main area, or copy and paste the entire file, which you find attached, whatever you prefer. With that done, you should see something like this on the screen, which I would say looks a lot better than what we had before. But of course here we also have this blank space where I want to add that image slideshow, and that is therefore what we'll work on next. So I want to add a little image slideshow here, which basically automatically goes through some food images that should show up here. And for that, we'll build a new component. We could also build it in here, but to keep that file relatively lean, I will add a new component. And I'll do that here in my root components folder. There, I'll add a subfolder called images, and in there, I'll add a image-slideshow.js file. And now here I actually already prepared the content for this file for you, and you therefore find my finished image slideshow.js file attached. And you can simply paste the content of that file into your image slideshow.js file. Attached you also find an image slideshow module.css file, which you should add next to your JavaScript file. Now what's this JavaScript file doing though? Well, it's outputting some relatively simple markup where I have a div, and in that div I go through a bunch of images and output the NextJS image component for every image. Now those images are simply being imported from the assets folder. So we're talking about the images stored in that assets folder. Not all of them, but some of them, all those food images specifically. And then I'm setting up this images array here, which contains all these images and then some alt texts for the images. And then I'm outputting them here. Now, the most interesting part, therefore, is what we have above that JSX code. Because here I'm using useState, so the standard useState hook provided by React, to control some state which changes over time. To be precise, it changes with help of useEffect every 5 seconds with help of setInterval. And that interval is cleared whenever the component unmounts by using this cleanup function of useEffect. And that's standard useEffect and standard useState as you know it from vanilla JavaScript. Nothing Next.js specific here. The logic inside of this interval code here, inside of useEffect, is simply that we change the index of the visible image every 5 seconds, and we therefore cycle through all those images. That's all we're doing here. With that, we can go to that page.js file, to that div here where I'm saying slideshow, and in there we can now output that image slideshow component. Of course, you also must add that import though. But if you try to do that, you'll notice that you get an error if you want to preview the site. There in that error, you're learning that we're importing a component that needs useState and that only works in a client component, but that none of its parents are marked with useClient. So they're in a server component. And what does that now mean? Now that's something that's super important in Next.js. Next.js knows server components, React server components, and client components. And actually, that's technically not just Next.js. Instead, React itself has this differentiation, though in most React apps, in all those vanilla React apps, which you're building with help of Create React App or with help of Vite, you are using client components out of the box. Because in those projects, React.js is a pure client-side library running code in the browser on the client. With Next.js, that changes because Next.js is a full-stack framework. It has a backend, not just a frontend. And therefore, code also executes on that backend when working with Next.js. And for example, by default, all those React components you have in your Next.js project, no matter if they're pages, layouts, or standard components, are only rendered on the server. That's why they're called React server components. Now, as mentioned, that's actually technically a feature built into React, but it must be unlocked, you could say, with a certain behind-the-scenes build process and structure that's not part of most React projects. But it is unlocked and it is the standard in Next.js projects. Therefore, there by default, all React components are such React server components and are only rendered on the server. So that means that this component and this layout component, but also the slideshow component and the header components, all those components do not execute in the browser. Those component functions don't execute there, but instead on the server. And you can see that that's the case if you console log executing here in this main header component, for example. If you do that, and you then go to the page.js file and you temporarily comment out the image slideshow component, since it's causing an error, which we'll fix soon, and you also comment out that import, you'll see that if you save everything and you reload, if you open your browser developer tools, you will not see that executing log here. So that executing log, which we are logging in the main header, it's not showing up here because the main header component function never executes in the browser. Instead, it executes on the server. And therefore, if you open that terminal where you started the development server, which is running that server-side code, therefore, you see those executing logs. So it's there where those components execute. And what's interesting is that this is not just the case for the initial page load, but also for subsequent navigations. So if I, for example, also log something on that meals page, if I console log meals page here, and I then reload the starting page, and I click on explore meals to be taken to that meals page, I don't see that log here either. Even though I used that link and we therefore stayed in that single page application. We did not fetch a brand new page. But even though that's the case, I don't see the log here. Instead, I see it here in that backend log. And that's happening because even if you are in that single page application mode and you're navigating around, all the components will still be rendered on the server, on the backend, and in the end, it's kind of the finished HTML code that's then sent to the client to be rendered there. It's technically a bit different, but that is how you can think about it. And therefore, Next.js embraces this concept of having those server components. Now, that's an important concept and an important advantage of Next.js projects, because with server components, you have potentially less client-side JavaScript code that must be downloaded, hence possibly improving the performance of your website. And it's also great for search engine optimization, because web search crawlers now see pages that contain the complete finished content. Compare that with a vanilla JavaScript project where you're not using a framework like Next.js. There, if you take a look at the source code of a page, you'll see that it's essentially an empty page. because all the content is created and populated on the client side by client-side code with help of those client-side components. In Next.js projects, that's different. If you take a look at the source code there, you will see that all the content is in there. All that text that's visible on the screen is part of the actual page source code. And that is also what web search engine crawlers will see. So that's why we have this concept of server components and why it's an important concept. Nonetheless, in Next.js projects, you can still also build client components. And that would be components that are still technically pre-rendered on the server, but then also potentially rendered on the client. And most importantly, these are components that must be rendered on the client because they contain some code or use some features that are only available on the client. Like for example here in this image slideshow.js file, the useState hook or the useEffect hook. These hooks are not available on the server side, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because we're not interested in setting this interval on the server side. We want to run this in the browser so that the image swaps every 5 seconds after the page has been loaded. Another example for a feature that would only be available in client components would be event handlers. So if you would use the onClick prop to trigger some function. Obviously, since you're waiting for some user interaction here, that would require to be a client component because that would require code that runs on the client. But since by default in Next.js all components are server components, you have to explicitly tell Next.js if you want to build a client component by using a special directive at the top of the file that holds that component. To be precise, you have to add the useClient directive. And that then allows you to use client-side features in your component, like event handlers or useEffect and useState. So therefore here, in order to make this slideshow component work, we have to add this useClient directive at the top of this file. And with that added, we can go back to that main page and bring back that import and bring back that component here. And now you will see that if you reload, this works. We no longer get an error, and we now have that image here, which changes every 5 seconds. And that's now the behavior I want here, now unlocked with help of client components. And it's super important to know about this difference and to understand that these two component types exist in general in React, but really only work and can be used when using a framework like Next.js. So now that we finished this starting page, let's as a next step work on this community page. And for that page, it's actually quite straightforward. I just want to populate it with some dummy content. And therefore attached, you find my finished page.js file and you can simply replace yours with it. So replace your community page.js file with the one you find attached. Attached, you then also find a page.module.css file, which you should also add next to the community page.js file so that the required styles are available. Now in that page.js file, you then see that I got a community component function exported there, and in that component, I'm just outputting some dummy text and some images in the end. So that if you save everything, the community page should look something like this. Simply outputting some dummy fallback text. Because of course the main logic of this overall demo project will be related to the meals. It's there where we'll fetch data and add new meals and so on. And we'll get back to that soon. That's why here I just provided some dummy content for you. Now with that community page populated, there's one thing about the header, or about this navigation specifically, that I'd like to improve. We currently don't see which page is active. I am on the community page, but this link here is not highlighted when I'm on it. And it would be nice if it were highlighted. And to achieve this, we can go back to this main header component where we have this navigation and edit this link a little bit. To be precise, I want to add a class conditionally to that link, depending on whether the page to which this link leads is the active page or not. Now for that, in that main header module CSS file, I did prepare a CSS class called active that can be added to a link to give it some active styling. Therefore, all we have to do here is find out whether this should be marked as active or not. And we can find out whether that's the case or not by taking a look at the current path name, so the part after the domain. For example, for this community link, the path is /community. Hence, we know that if the path is equal to this path, this link here should be marked as active. For the meals page and the meals related pages, we know that this link here should be marked as active if we are on /meals or /meals share or some other nested page. So if the currently active path starts with /meals. And therefore we just need to get hold of the currently active path. And that, thankfully, is also quite straightforward to do because NextJS gives you a use path name hook, which you can import from Next Navigation. And this hook gives you the currently active path, so the part after the domain. And with that path available, we can then set this meals link here to active if the path, which I'm getting from use path name, if that path starts with /meals. So that this link here is marked as active no matter if we're on the meals page or some nested page. That's why I'm using starts with. Now if that yields true, I want to add the active CSS class, however not like this, but since we're using CSS modules, instead like this. And otherwise I'll add undefined as a class, so that no class is added. Well, and now we can repeat that process on the other link and simply copy that class name code over there. Here I just want to check whether the path starts with community or, since we don't have any nested pages here, if the path is equal to /community. And then I still want to add the active class or no class at all. Now, if we do that though, you'll be greeted by an error, because it turns out that use path name also only works in client components. And that's, by the way, a convenient feature of Next.js. It will tell you if you're using a feature that doesn't work in server components in a server component, so that you can then add that use client directive. So here the fix is to add use client at the top of this header. But here's something to keep in mind. Whilst you can do that, and the error will then go away, and you can now see that the active link is highlighted, whilst that all works, you typically wanna add use client as far down the component tree as possible, so that you really only turn the components that need to be converted to client components into client components, so that the majority of your components can stay server components and are rendered on the server, so that you don't lose those server component advantages for most of your components. And therefore here, since this header component contains quite a lot of markup that does not need to be a client component, I'll take a different approach. I'll add a new component file, navlink.js, sounds like a fitting name, and I'll add a navlink.module.css file next to it. And the idea in this JavaScript file now is to export a component function that can be called navlink. That should simply output that navlink. So in the main header.js file, I'll simply grab this link here and only that. I'll cut it and return it here. Now for that we must import the link component from NextLink. And of course, we should make navlink configurable. So here I want to get the ref prop, and I'll use the children prop for the actual text that's output between the link. And then here I'll use children, and here I'll use ref. And then here I'll also use this ref prop when I check whether this is the active link. Of course, in order for path to be available here, we now must use the use path name hook I just showed you before, so that we can get hold of the path. And we therefore have to convert this into a client component by adding use client like this. But now it's only that component, and therefore only this small piece of markup that will be rendered on the client side. We can go back to the main header.js file now and get rid of use client here, and get rid of that use path name import, and get rid of the use path name usage, because now there we can simply use that newly added navlink component. So I'm importing that from the navlink component file, and I'm then outputting it like this. And you can use client components inside of server components like this. We did do that before with the image slideshow. We're now doing it again here with the navlink. Now navlink then takes the link text here between those tags. So in this case, browse meals. And we must set this ref prop here to /meals. And of course, now we can also use that here for the community. Here we now have our foodies community also turned into a navlink. We just have to make sure that we point to /community. And with that, we made sure that this main header component is not converted to a client component and is therefore still rendered on the server, and instead only this small part of it is rendered on the client. Now, of course, here I'm now getting an error that classes is not defined, because in navlink I'm referring to the active class, even though this class's object isn't available here. And to work around that, I'll simply add an import here, where I import classes from navlink.module.css. Of course, at the moment, this is an empty CSS file though, and therefore we should go to the main header module CSS file and grab the active class here and add that here in that navlink module CSS file. We can actually also grab the link related styles here and cut those, and also add them here in the navlink.module file, and change the selector from an anchor element nested in some element with a nav class to maybe link. So to elements that have the link class on them, like this, here and here. And with that back in navlink.js, we can add that link class to these links, so that we either have link and the active class added, or just link. And to make that work, I'll convert this here into a template literal string, into which we can easily inject dynamic values that will be converted to strings, so that here I have classes link and classes active being set on the link. And otherwise, if the link is not active, I just add classes link. Like this. And that's now my adjusted navlink. And with that, everything works again, but now only the navlinks are also rendered on the client. All the rest is still only rendered on the server. Now that we worked on the starting page and the community page and improved the header, it's finally time to work on that meals page. And it's time to output some meals there before we then thereafter will make sure that users can also share meals. Now for that, it's this page.js file in the meals folder on which will work. And there I want to output a bunch of meals. A bunch of meals which will soon store in a database. But before we'll do that, let's set up the base markup of this page. The base structure of this page, you could say. And here I again want to have a header section and then below that the main section of this page. I also again prepared some styles and therefore attached you find another page.module CSS file, the page.module CSS file for this meals page. And we can and should then import this page.module CSS file, again using this special CSS modules import syntax so that we can access the CSS classes set up in that file. Because there, for example, should be a class added to this header. The header class, like this. I also want to add a class to the main section, and that is the main class that's added here. Now, inside of that header, I then want to have an h1 element where I say delicious meals created and then a span by you. And I'm using that span for some extra styling because to that span I want to assign a class, to be precise, the highlight class, like this. Below this h1 element, we can then add a paragraph which simply outputs some dummy text like choose your favorite recipe and cook it yourself. It is easy and fun. You can of course output whatever you want. Now below that paragraph, I want to have yet another paragraph which should receive a class name of CTA for call to action, because in there I then want to have a link using the next link component, which therefore of course also is imported as it always is. And I'm using that link component to link to that share page. So to /meals/share, which will be the page that can be used by users later to share their own meals with the community. And therefore I'll say share your favorite recipe. So that's now this header area of this meals page, and we could of course put that into a separate component. If you wanted to, you could do that. You just have to make sure that you bring along the necessary styles, but here I'll keep it all in one component. I will add a separate component for outputting the meals though. And therefore for that, back in my root components folder, I'll add a meals subfolder to store any meal related components. And there I'll add a meals-grid.js file. Now the job of this meals-grid.js file will be to output a bunch of meal items in a grid. So therefore of course we start by exporting a component function. I'll name it meals-grid. And I expect to get the meals that should be output here as a prop. And then I'll output an unordered list, and in that list I'll map through all meals so that for every meal we can output a list item. Now every list item here needs a key, and the key can be meal.id because every meal will have an ID. And then inside of that list item, I want to output the meal item details. Now, before we work on that, I also prepared a CSS file, mealsgrid.module, which you find attached, which you should then import into this mealsgrid.js file, just as we always did it with all those .module CSS files, so that we can add a class here to that unordered list. A class called meals, like this. And now I'll add another component here, the mealitem.js file. And I prepared a mealitem.module CSS file, which is also attached. And attached you also find my finished mealitem.js file, which is a relatively straightforward component that simply accepts a bunch of props and then outputs those props in a structured way. Now, what's interesting about this component is, for one, that it then has a link that takes us to a specific meal detail page. And here the path is constructed dynamically with a dynamically injected segment that will be different for every meal because we have that dynamic meal details page. Here, this page, which expects a dynamic value for that path segment, so that we can visit that details page for different meals. And in the end here, where I'm constructing this path, it's this dynamic slug, which will be different for every meal, that will be used as a concrete value for this placeholder. So that's one interesting thing in this component, that will have this dynamic link that will lead us to different meal detail pages. The other interesting thing is this image component. It's this next image component, and it's interesting here because the images I'm outputting here will now not be imported manually from that assets folder. Instead, we'll be working with meals that are stored in a database, and their images are stored in the public folder. Now, it turns out that these are the same images as in the assets folder, but that's just a coincidence here. Later, users will be able to upload their own images and share their own meals, and that's something we have to keep in mind when using this image component, because this image component needs to know the underlying width and height of the image that's being output. So not the width and height you want to have on the screen, but the width and height of the image you're trying to render. And it's able to detect that automatically when you're using the image component, as we did it in the header, on an image that's imported from the local file system, as we're doing it here with the logo. In that case, NextJS is able to look up the width and height. But for those meal items, we'll load them dynamically from a database, and then in the database we'll have a path pointing to some image. And NextJS will not be able to resolve the width and height of such an image, of such a dynamically loaded and resolved image, simply because the information is not available at build time, as it's the case for all imported images, but only at runtime. And that's why I added this special fill prop here. An alternative would have been to explicitly set the width and height of the images that will be output here, but the problem is that I don't know that in advance, because we'll also be dealing with images shared by the user. And in such scenarios, fill is an alternative. This then tells NextJS that it should simply fill the available space with that image, as defined by its parent component. And I set up appropriate CSS styles that make sure that this will look good. And I'm mentioning this here because it is, of course, a common scenario that you're displaying images where you might not know their dimensions in advance. And in such cases, fill is a great alternative to explicitly setting a width or height, which you should do though if you know the width and height in advance. So that's therefore this meal item component added, and with that added, we can output it here in the meals grid component. So here, between those li tags, I'll output the meal item like this, and I'll simply forward all those meal properties from that meal we have here to that meal item. So I use this syntax to pull out all the properties of that meal object and spread them as key value pairs, so as props in the end, onto this meal item. And since the meal I get here, since the meals I'll have in this meals array eventually will have all those properties that are expected as props here, this approach will work just fine. Now, of course, at the moment we have no data source yet, so at the moment we won't see anything on the screen. Nonetheless, we can already take this meals grid component here and go to this page.js file in the meals folder and output it here. But at the moment, I'll set meals to an empty array because, as mentioned, we have no meals yet. So if we save that and we go to that browse meals page, we see our header, which allows us to go to that share meal page, but we see no meals yet. But that's what we'll add next. So in order for this meals grid component to be useful, and in order to see something on the screen here, we need meals. And for that, I want to set up a basic database that will store some dummy meals and that will later also store meals shared by users. And for that, I'll stop my development server here with Ctrl+C, and I'll install a new dependency with npm install. And that dependency is the better-SQLite 3 package. And this is a package that will allow us to work with a SQLite database. And I'll use a SQLite database here because it's an amazing SQL database that can be used locally without setting up any extra database server or any other complex setup needed. Now, in order to create a database and populate it with some dummy data, I prepared an initdb.js file, which you find attached to this lecture. And you should store that file simply in your root project directory. This file uses the package we just installed to create a new database file if it doesn't exist yet. Otherwise, it'll use the existing one. And it then contains a bunch of dummy meals data, so that we have some meals to get started, which are then written into that database. That happens down here. First, a new table is created if it doesn't exist yet, and the columns of that table are configured so that every meal has an ID, which is created automatically. Every meal has a unique slug. Every meal has a title, an image, though that will be the path to an image, not the file itself. And then also a summary, instructions, the name of the creator, and the email of the creator. And that's all data I have here in that dummy data, and that's all data we'll later collect from the website visitors. And then with that table created, I have this initData function, which is then executed to write some data into that database. I'm simply writing all those dummy meals into the database. And this prepare function, which you see here, is provided by that better SQLite 3 package. So that's how I'm preparing the database. And with that done, once you run this initdb.js file, you should have some meals available. So here in my root project folder, I'll execute this initdb.js file with Node, and it should work, and you should have such a mealsdb file thereafter. That is that SQLite database that we'll use now. Now with that done, we can go back to our meals page and start loading meals from that database. And the question now, of course, is how we do that. Now, when it comes to loading data in a Next.js application, we got a couple of different options. We could fetch the data as we would do it in any vanilla React application. We could, for example, use the useEffect hook, like this, and then in there use the fetch function to send a request to a backend. And on that backend, we could then reach out to that database which we just set up and get the data from here. Now, in a Next.js application, we actually already have a backend. We have backend and frontend combined, blended seamlessly together. So we don't need a separate backend. And as you also learned, in Next.js, all your components are by default server components that only execute on the server, unless you're using a feature that requires them to be a client component, like useEffect. But actually, because we have those server components as a default, we don't need useEffect, and we don't need to send a fetch request to get data. Instead, since this component by default runs on the server and only there, we can directly reach out to the database from here. And that's definitely not something you're used to from other React apps, but that's absolutely fine in Next apps because this is a server component that only runs on the server. So reaching out to a database is safe here. Now, in order to keep things separated, I'll not write my code in here though. Instead, I'll add a new folder in my root project folder, which I'll name lib. Though that name is up to you and not some kind of reserved name. But in there, I'll add a new file, which I'll name meals.js. And in here, I want to write the code that reaches out to a database and gets data from that database. For that, in here, I'll import SQL from this better SQLite free package. And I'll then establish the database connection by executing SQL as a function and then passing the name of the database here as a string to that function. And then we can work on this DB object to perform actions on that database. Now for that, I'll add a new exported function here, which I'll name getMeals, which should do what the name implies. It should get all the meals from that database. And for that, we can now use this DB object and then prepare a new statement, a new SQL statement that should be executed. And here it's a pretty simple statement. I want to select all columns from the meals table. Then we just have to run this, though you actually don't do that with the run method here, but with the all method. Run would be used if you were inserting data, for example, if you were changing data. All is used if you're fetching data and you want to get back all rows that are fetched by that statement. If you were looking for a single row, you could use get instead. But here it's multiple rows, so it's all. And then we just have to return this result. This also doesn't yield a promise or anything like that. Instead, you can just return it like this. But speaking of promises, it's worth knowing and understanding that even though we're not working with promises here, because the better SQLite free package doesn't use them, even though we're not using them here, we could use them in our component here with ease. Because server component functions can actually be converted to async functions. You can use the async keyword here, something you normally also can't do on your React components. But you can do it on server components. And if you then had some code that would use a promise, you could use await here. And to simulate this, I'll actually go back to meals.js and turn getMeals into async function. And therefore it will return a promise, even though this code here doesn't normally produce one. But now it will be wrapped into a promise. That is what async does. And I'll actually await another promise here, which simply adds an arbitrary delay, just to simulate an action that takes a bit longer, which is something that will help us later once we explore how we can handle loading states and so on in Next applications. This is of course not code you would normally add, because you would not want to slow things down, but here for this demo app I'll add it to add this extra delay. And this also allows me to show you that you can use async await here, of course, because it's a regular function, but you can also use it here in this component function. And that's not something you can normally do in React, but you can do it with server components. So here we can then await the call to get meals, to get the meals data, and we'll get back our meals here. Just like that, without use effect, without any unnecessary fetch request being sent. And with that done, we can therefore then use these meals. Down here, where we have that meals grid, we can simply pass meals to meals grid. And with all that done, if you save everything and you restart that development server, you should be able to reload this meals page and see all those meals here. Now, just a brief note at this point, I had a tiny error in my styles when I recorded these videos, which is why for me the meals look the way they do on the screen. For you, they should look like this, because I fixed that styling error in the attachment. Now besides that, nothing changes. It was just a styling error. I just wanted to mention it here so that you're not wondering why you have those extra titles here and I don't have them. Now navigating to their details, will work, but will not show you anything, of course, because we haven't added that logic. But you can see those meals here. And that's now data being fetched from the databases and images being fetched from that public folder, because that's where we're storing them, and that's in the end where the paths that are stored in the database will point to. And those images work the way they do because of that setup we got in that meal item.js file. So now that we're able to load those meals, there's one thing you might notice. When we reload this /meals page, it takes a couple of seconds until we see something on the screen. And that hopefully makes sense because we added this delay here in that function where we fetch the meals from the database. So we added a 2-second delay here, and that's why we have this 2-second pause before the page updates. Obviously, if we would make this longer, let's say 5 seconds, we'd have to wait for 5 seconds before we see anything on the screen. However, you then might notice that if you then go to another page and you come back, the meals page is there instantly, pretty much. We don't have to wait those 5 seconds then. And that's the case because NextJS performs some pretty aggressive caching under the hood. To be precise, it caches any page you visited, including the data of that page. And if you then go to another page and come back, it loads that existing page from the cache so that it can show it to you as quickly as possible. And only if you reload this page, if you leave the page and you come back essentially, only then is the page being recreated. Now that's of course great, but it would be nice if we had some loading indicator whilst this page is loading when we visit it. Because at the moment we have to wait for 5 seconds and we don't see anything during these 5 seconds. If I'm on the starting page, for example, and I reload that page, and I then go to browse meals, and it's therefore not in the cache, I'm sitting there and I'm not sure if my navigation request worked or not, because only after 5 seconds am I redirected to that page. And that's not a great user experience. This experience can be improved by adding another special file to our folder though. You can go to that page, which is loading data, which might take a bit longer, and next to it, you can add a loading.js file, which just like layout and page is a reserved file name. And this file will become active if the page next to it or any nested page or layout is loading data. And in that case, that loading.js content is shown as a fallback until the data is there. So here we can then therefore export a component function in that loading.js file and name it meals loading page or anything like that. And then in there, I want to return a paragraph where I say fetching meals. And I also want to have some styling for that, and therefore I prepared a loading.module CSS file, which you find attached, which sets up some basic styling for this loading.js file. In order to use it, we then just have to import classes from loading.module CSS and then add a class of the name loading, like this, to this paragraph. Well, and with that, if you save that and you then reload this page, you see this fetching meals text until the data is there. And if we were to go to the starting page and we then navigate to browse meals, we also see this immediately now, hence knowing that our navigation worked and what's going on. And that's now, of course, a better user experience than what we had before. Still, it's not perfect yet, because of course, whilst it works, the loading text basically occupies the entire screen. But if we take a closer look at this meals page, we actually have that header here, which does not depend on any loaded data at all. So it would be great if we could show that header instantly and only show that loading text whilst we're waiting for the meals to be fetched. And that is also something we can implement with help of Next.js. Now, one way of implementing it would be to copy this header code here and also all the styles in the related CSS file and add that to the loading.js file. That would work, but it would not be ideal. In addition, this loading.js file will also be used for any nested layouts and pages, and there we might not want that header whilst waiting for data. So a better solution is to not use this loading.js file here, and hence I'll name it loading-out, so that it does not have any special purpose anymore, because that's now not a file name Next.js will be looking for. And I renamed it instead of deleting it so that we can still see it and you still have that as an alternative. And I just noticed that I actually added the loading files in my root app directory. Now it still worked because, as I mentioned, it will be applied to any nested pages and layouts as well. So it worked for that meals page, but I actually wanted those files in the meals folder. So I will now move them there, even though I have now renamed it and we're not using it anymore. But that would have been the place where I wanted it, even though it worked either way, because it does apply to nested pages. But now we're going to go to that meals page.js file here, because Next.js also gives us another way of handling loading states, a more granular way. Because we can simply go to the place where we have some operation that may take a bit longer, like here loading that data. And we can then create a separate component. Here I'll do it in the same file, since it'll be a component that's closely connected to this meals page. And I'll name this component meals. And the idea behind this component is that it's now this component that will fetch the data. So this code here goes into this component. And hence this must be an async component, which it can be because it's a server component by default. Now async can be removed here on the meals page because I'm not using a wait in there anymore. But now my idea is that meals is responsible for returning this meals grid. So I'll cut that from the meals page component and instead return that here where I'm fetching the meals. And it's now the meals component that can be used down there, like this. But what's now the advantage of this approach? The advantage is that we now outsourced the data fetching part into a separate component, and we can now wrap this component with a component that's built into React. We can wrap this here with the suspense component, like this. And suspense is a component that is provided by React, hence you must import it from React. Suspense is a component provided by React that allows you to handle loading states and show fallback content until some data or resource has been loaded. And Next.js embraces this suspense component and this React concept and makes sure that whenever you have a component like this one here, which performs some data fetching and returns such a promise here, that such components will trigger suspense to show the fallback until they're done. So you don't need to do anything else, you just have to set up the fallback prop on this suspense component and define the fallback content that should be shown whilst that wrapped component is loading some data. And in the end, this loading.js file, which we used before, is doing the same thing, just behind the scenes. It's wrapping the page content with this suspense component. And it's then showing this loading content here as a fallback. Now we can do this manually, and therefore I'll copy this paragraph, which I want to show as a fallback, and put that here. And for this loading class to be available, I'll go to my loading.module CSS file, copy all the code in there, and add it to my page module. For example, here at the end. Doesn't really matter. And with that, we're now telling React that it's now just for this part of the JSX code where we want to show our loading fallback. And therefore, if you save that, you'll see that now the header is there, but we have this loading text down there. And then that content is streamed in and rendered once it's there. So we don't reload the page or anything like that. Instead, Next.js partially renders this page with all the content that can already be rendered, and then streams in and renders this loaded content once it has been loaded. And that, of course, is now arguably a better user experience here. Now, this loading.js file, even though we're not using it anymore here, is not the only other special file you can add in that app folder in your next project. Because besides loading and page and layout, we, for example, can also add an error.js file, which will handle potential errors that might be generated by your pages and components. For example, if loading some data fails. And that, of course, could happen here. If our database is offline, which is unlikely for a SQLite database, but which could happen if it would be a remote database server, or if anything else goes wrong. And to simulate this, let's simply go to the lib folder and the meals.js file, and then here, let's throw an error. A new error where we say loading meals failed. Something like this, doesn't really matter. Now if I do that, and I remove this error.js file again, we'll re-add it soon, but if I remove it for now, you'll see that now if we reload this page, we'll load the data, and after 5 seconds we'll get an error. And the error screen we see here is just the development version of this error screen. In production, this would look differently. We see this screen during development so that it's easier for us as a developer to find and fix the error. In production, this would look differently. Now, therefore, it's a good idea to also add some error handling to your application. And you can do that by adding an error.js file. And in that file, you then set up a component that will be rendered by Next.js whenever an error occurs. Though it will only handle errors that occur in the page that sits in the same folder as this error.js file or any nested page or layout. Therefore, you could of course also add this on the root level of your application to catch any error that's caused anywhere in any of your pages. Again, you can be as granular as needed. Here, I'll go down one level so that I don't replace the entire site with my error screen, but instead only a part of that site. And here, I'll then simply output some main element with a class name of error. And I'm setting this class name like this because that's now actually a class I prepared in this globals CSS file, which was part of the starting project. And we're importing that globally, not as a CSS module. Therefore, those classes from that file can be used just like this. And then here I'll add a h1 element where I say an error occurred, and then maybe some details about that error. And for that, to learn more about this error, we can actually use some props here in this error page component. Because when setting up such a component in such an error.js file, Next.js will pass some props to that component. Most importantly, it will provide an error prop which can contain more details about the error. Now, the actual error message will actually be hidden by Next.js so that you can't accidentally expose any information that shouldn't be exposed to your end users. But if your error would be an object that also contains some error code or anything like that, you could use that here in this component to show a more fine-tuned error message. Here, I'll simply output a generic message and say, failed to fetch meal data. Please try again later. Now, if you add that and you reload this meals page here, you'll get something strange here. You'll get another error, where we learn that error.js must be a client component. And indeed, that's the case. This error component that's stored in an error.js file must be a client component Simply because Next.js basically ensures that you can catch any errors with that component, including errors that happen on the client side. So after the pages were rendered on the server. That's why this directive must be added here. And with it added, you see that this goes away. If we now reload, we'll of course still get an error, but now we get our custom error page here. Which you of course now could fine-tune if you wanted to, but here I'll go with that. And that's how we can therefore now handle errors like this. With that, of course, I'll go back to that meals.js file in the lib folder and comment out that line of code. Because I don't want to throw an error, I just wanted to show you how you could handle them. Now, since we're already talking about errors, there's another kind of error that could occur. What happens if a user enters an invalid URL? Something like my-meals, which is a path we're not supporting here. In that case, we get this default 404 page, with which you might be happy, of course. No need to change it. But if you want to, you can change it. And to do that, you can add a notfound.js file, like this. And again, you can add that anywhere in your app folder, and it will automatically cover any sibling and nested pages. So if I add it here on the root level, we can simply catch all not found errors that might be generated from anywhere in this application. If you would want to be more granular and maybe show more granular error messages, you could nest it into some other folder. Now here I will go with that global level, and then again export a function here which I'll name not found. And then here I'll simply return a main element with a class name of not-found, which is another CSS class I prepared in that globals CSS file. And I'll then add a title of not found, and I'll below that output a text where I'll say, unfortunately, we could not find the requested page or resource. Like this. And with that added, you'll see that now, for invalid pages, we see our custom not found page here. But with that, I'll now go back to my meals, because as a next step, I want to make sure that we can not just see all meals, but that we can also browse the meal details. So let's now work on that meal details page here. For that, I'll go to this meals folder, and then there this dynamic segment folder, this meal slug folder, and then there this page.js file, because that is the component responsible for outputting the details about a meal. Now here I again then want to output a fragment, because I want to have a header and next to that the main section, as we had it on many other pages as well. Now I also prepared some styles for this page, so attached you find a page.module CSS file, which you should store next to this page.js file. And then we can import our classes from that page.module CSS file. So that then we can, for example, add a class here to this header. A class named header. In that header, I then want to have a couple of things. For example, I want to have a div in there with a class of image, which will then be responsible for outputting the meal image that belongs to a meal. And we will output that image with help of the image component, which is provided by Next.js, imported from the Next image package. Now we'll configure this image later, because at the moment we don't have the meal yet. We'll add the logic for that soon though. The only thing I want to add already is this fill prop here, since again I won't know the exact dimensions of the image file yet, and therefore I'll use this fill prop as a fallback or as a solution. Then below that I'll add another div with a class of header text, written like this, not with a dash, but instead camel case. That's how the CSS class name in the CSS file is named. In there, You should then add a h1 element, where we'll later output the meal title, and below that a paragraph, which receives another CSS class, a class of creator, where I want to output the text by, and then the name of the creator wrapped into a link. And here I'll use the regular anchor element because this should actually be a link that allows us to send an email to that creator. Therefore, the actual href value will be a dynamically generated string using this string literal syntax with those backticks here, where I'll say mail to, and then here I'll inject that email address once we have it later. And that's how we can set up a link that will open the mail program so that users can send an email to that person. Below that, we can add another paragraph, which also receives a class. And here the class should be the summary class, where I want to output the short summary text that summarizes a meal. And that's then this header. Of course, a lot of data is missing, but we'll take care of that soon. Now in that main section, I simply want to output one paragraph, which receives a CSS class name called instructions. And then here I want to output the instructions that are stored for every meal. And those should actually be output as HTML code, which can be achieved in React by targeting the dangerously set inner HTML prop on an element. And it's called like this because you open yourself up to cross-site scripting attacks when outputting content as HTML content, at least if you're not validating it. Now this prop then wants an object as a value, and that object should have an underscore HTML property, which then contains the actual HTML code that should be output on the screen. Now we'll get that code later from that meal once we fetched it, but that's how we'll output it on the screen. So that this is in the end our meal details page without the data that we want to output. Now in order to have some data to output on that meal detail screen, we should go back to that meals.js file in the lib folder, and there we can export another async function that could be called getMeal. And here I then expect to get the slug of the meal that identifies the meal that should be fetched. Well, and then we simply want to return db prepare and then select all columns from the meals table where the slug field is equal to the slug we're getting here. Now you could now add it like this, but that would be insecure. That opens yourself up to SQL injection. Instead, you should use a question mark as a placeholder here, and then call the get method here, since I only want to get a single record. And then you pass the value that should be inserted for that placeholder to get. In this case, that's slug, which we get here. Under the hood, this better SQLite 3 package we're using here will then protect you against SQL injection attacks. That's why you should add dynamic values into your statements like this. So that should then return a meal. So we can therefore go back to this meals detail page here. And now in there, call get meal. And import that from that lib folder and the meals.js file there. Here we'll then get back a meal, which we can then use down there to, well, populate this JSX code. But getMeal, of course, needs that slug. And that slug is simply that part that's encoded in the URL. That is caught with help of this placeholder here, this meal slug placeholder. So how do we then get access to that concrete value that's part of the URL? With help of the props we're receiving on this page. I mentioned before that NextJS is passing some special props to these special files, or to these components in those special files. And for example, every component that's stored in a page.js file will receive a special params prop, which you can therefore destructure. And this params prop will then itself contain an object as a value, where any dynamic path segment that's configured for this route will be stored as a key value pair. And this name you chose here between those square brackets will be used as a key, and the actual value encoded in the URL will be used as a value for that key. And it is that value I need to get to look for that value in the database. So therefore, we can now pass params.mealSlug to getMeal. And that will be that identifier that hopefully allows us to fetch a meal from the database. Now to see whether that worked, let's try outputting a title here with meal.title, like this. If we do that and save everything, I don't get anything here. Now the reason for that is that getMeal actually returns a promise because I'm using this async keyword here. And I added that so that we could add such a delay again, if we wanted to, and if we wanted to set up a dedicated loading page or handle loading in any other way. Now I actually won't do that here, and therefore we can simply get rid of the async keyword. Therefore getMeal will no longer return a promise, and therefore now the code should work. Indeed, if I now go back, I now see that title here, which is now fetched from the database. And of course that means that we can now also output all the other data. For example, on the image, we can set the src prop here to meal.image. Because we'll have such an image key in the database and we're fetching that data now. The alt text can be set to meal.title. Here for the email address, we can use meal.creator_email, because that's the name I'm using in the database. You can see those names if you take a look at this initdb.js file. There I have these field names, and that's what I'm now accessing here in this meal detail page. And the name can therefore be output by using meal.creator. Now for the summary, it's meal.summary. And for the HTML code down there, it's meal.instructions, without those curly braces though. With all that done, if you now go back and reload, you should see this meal page here. Now you'll also see that this content down there is not formatted perfectly, and the reason for that is that the line breaks we got in these instructions are ignored. We can fix this by overriding meal.instructions with meal.instructions.replace, hence replacing parts of that string. And here we can then use a regular expression to look for all line breaks, which are identified by this special character. Look for all of them in this string, and by then replacing them with the BR tag, the line break tag. If we do that, you see that the line breaks are back. And that's now how we can load and display those meal details. Now it is possible that a user tries to look for a meal that doesn't exist, like Great Bolo. And in that case, I get this an error occurred page. Now I'm getting this error occurred page because I'm trying to access the instructions on undefined, because I wasn't able to load a meal. So it's good that we get some fallback page, but it's not actually an error that occurred if we look at it from a technical perspective. Instead, we simply did not find the requested meal. So a better way of handling this would be to go here and check if not meal, so if meal is undefined, if we didn't find a meal, and then show the closest not found page available in this project. And that can indeed be triggered by calling a special function that's provided by NextJS. The NotFound function, which is imported from Next Navigation. Calling this function will stop this component from executing and will show the closest not found or error page. So if we have an error page that's closer, as it's the case here, than the closest not found page, it will still show that. But we can work around that by also adding a notfound.js file here inside of the meals folder. And then we can also set up some meal specific not found message, like meal not found. And then maybe say, maybe we could not find the requested page or meal data, something like this. And with that, if you now reload, you see that we get this not found page content here, this meal specific not found page content. And that's of course arguably a better user experience. So now that we're able to load meals and then also view the details of a meal, it would of course be nice if we could also add our own meals. And that's therefore what we'll work on next. For that, it is this page.js file in this share folder, in this meals folder, which we will now work on, because that's the page that is responsible for displaying what we can see here. Now, to save you some time, I already prepared this share meal page for you. So attached you find my share meal page component in this page.js file, and you can simply replace your share page.js file with that. In that page component, you see I'm outputting a header with some dummy text, and then a main section with a form. And that form then contains a couple of inputs with labels, and one special input here at the end, on which we'll work in a couple of minutes. An image picker, which will allow us to pick and upload an image, because that will be part of this form. Now, this form won't work yet. We won't be able to submit it yet, or to be precise, we don't have any code that would handle the submission, but that's something we'll work on together later. Now, attached you also find a page.module CSS file, which contains the necessary styles for this page. And therefore, with all that added, if you save everything, you should see this form on the screen when you visit this page. And that doesn't look too bad. But I also mentioned this image picker, and that's something we'll work on next before we then thereafter make sure that this form can be submitted. So I got this image picker placeholder here, and my idea here simply is to display an image picker that can be used by the user to attach an image to the form and to upload an image when the form is submitted. Now for that, I'll actually build a separate component, since this image picker is a bit more complex, and hence I'll go to this components folder, and then there in the meals folder, I'll add my image picker.js file. We could also add it in any other subfolder here, but since I'm only using it in this meal-related form, I'll add it here. Attached you also find an image picker.module.css file with some styles we'll use. And then here, we can and should export a component function that can be called image picker, like this. And the job of this component function is to output some markup and then also handle the picking process. Now for the markup, I'll start with a div here with a class name of classes.picker. And for classes to be available, we should of course import classes from /imagepicker.module.css. And then in that div, I want to start by adding a label. A label with a configurable text, which is expected to be received via props. So I'll add the label prop here and then use that here for outputting that label text. Now I will add the HTML4 prop here to connect this label to some input, and I'll connect it to an input with a name of image, or with an ID of image to be precise. And therefore we of course also need such an input, but I will nest that input into a div here. A div to which I assign a class name of controls. And then in there I want to have an input element where the type should be set to file, because this should be an input that allows us to select a file. Now the ID here should be image, so that we connect this label to this input. And I'll add the accept prop to control which files are accepted. And here I only want to accept files that are of type image PNG or image JPEG. So no other files can be uploaded with help of that picker. I'll also give this input a name of image, which will later be important for extracting that uploaded image. Alternatively, we can also make this image picker a bit more configurable by accepting that name as a prop and then setting this like this. We could now also use this name as a value for the ID to make this even more configurable, and I will do that here. Also using it here for HTML4. Now with that we got a very basic unfinished version, but we can now use this image picker in our form. So back in page.js in this form here where I have this image picker, we can output the image picker using our own custom image picker component. Of course, for that you must import it from that components folder. And with that added, you will see that image picker here. Now this would work. You could now click it and then select images, but I actually want to make this image picker a bit more fancy. I want to make sure that it also shows a preview of the picked image, and I want to get rid of this ugly button here and instead display my own button over which I have full control. And therefore, back here in the image picker JS file, we can start by adding a class here to this input, and that should be the input class. And this class will essentially make sure that the input itself is hidden. So now we can't see it anymore down there, because I instead now want to render my own button. So therefore, here, maybe after the input, we can output a button which should receive a class of button, and which should be of type button, which is important so that it won't submit the surrounding form. If you would not set the type, it would by default be type submit, and it would submit the surrounding form, which I don't want to happen here. So the type should be button. And then we can set a text of pick an image here on that button. Now with that, we got this button here, which is great, but of course the button isn't doing anything. And what I want the button to do is click this input, which is not visible anymore, for me. It's still part of the DOM, it's just not visible because of the CSS styles I applied. And now I want to use my own button to click this input under the hood, so that I still leverage this input, but I don't show it because it's not looking that nice. Now to make that work, we of course need to handle clicks on this button and then forward them, so to say, to this input. Now we can handle clicks to this button by adding a function here to our image picker, like handle pick click or anything like that. And now we can assign this function as a value for the onClick prop here. Now if you do that, you'll be greeted by an error, because as I briefly mentioned earlier, event handlers like this, so whenever you are assigning a function or any value to the onClick prop or any other event handling prop, cannot be used in server components. Which kind of makes sense, because those interactions happen on the client, in the browser. The user clicks on the button in the browser. Therefore, we must mark this image picker as a client component by adding this useClient directive at the top of this file. With that done, the error goes away. But of course, we're not doing anything when the user clicks the button. What I want to do is, as mentioned, forward that click. I want to trigger a click on this input. And we can do that with help of refs, a feature built into React. We can create a ref with the useRef hook, which is imported from React, so which has nothing to do with Next.js, but which instead works the way you know it from React, which gives you a ref, like an image input ref, that you can then connect to an HTML element. And I'll actually just name it image input. But now we can use that ref and set it as a value for the ref prop on this image input field here, like this. And that now allows us to use this ref to trigger the click method. However, of course, we have to access .current first, because that then gives us access to the actual connected element and object. But that then is the code we can use to trigger a click on this input, which is connected to this ref. With that, if I now click my own button, this image picker opens up again. But now, as a final step, I want to make sure that as soon as I pick an image, I also show a preview of that here. Now, to show a preview of the picked image, we need to handle the event that an image was picked, and then store some state so that we can update this UI and show a preview as soon as we have an image. So we need some state here in this component, and therefore we need the useState hook. This would require us to turn this component into a client component, but we already did this here, so no changes are needed. Now here with this state, I then want to manage the picked image. So I'll name this picked image and have a set picked image state updating function. And now we need a second event handler function here that could be called handle image change, which should be triggered whenever this input here has a new value. So whenever the change event on that input is emitted. And therefore we should add the onChange prop here and set handle image change as a value. Now here in handle image change, we'll then automatically get an event object, as you always do for those event handling functions in React. And we can use this event object to get hold of that picked image. We can get hold of that picked file by using event.target.files and then accessing the first file. This files property will exist because the target of this event is this input. And this file input object under the hood will have such a files property. That will be an array of all the files that have been picked, but here it'll only be one file that can be picked, and therefore I'll just access that first file. You could allow the user to pick multiple files by adding the multiple prop here to this file input, but since we don't have that here and don't want it here, it'll only be one file that we can access. Now it's possible that the user actually did not pick a file for some reason, so I'll check if the file is undefined, if we got no file, and in that case I'll just return and not continue. But if we make it past this if check, we know that some file has been selected. Now in order to show it as a preview here, I now want to convert it into a so-called data URL, which is simply a value that can be used as an input for an image element. So that can be used as a source for an image element. And we can generate such a data URL with help of a class built into JavaScript, the file reader class. We can construct such a file reader and then do what its name implies. We can read our file. And we can simply call file reader read as data URL and pass that file to that method. Now this method works in a bit of a strange way because it doesn't actually return anything. not a promise, not the red file, and it also doesn't take a callback. Instead, we get hold of that data URL that's being generated by assigning a value to the onload property of this file reader object. So we store a function as a value in onload, and this function will then be triggered by the file reader once this method here, this read as data URL method, is done. But here we then won't get the generated URL as an input. Instead, we can access it by accessing filereader.result. And that will then be that generated URL. And that's what I then want to store in my state. So I will set my picked image to the result of accessing filereader.result inside of this onload function. Well, and with that, we can then use this picked image state to show a preview. So down here, in this controls div, I'll add another div with a class name of preview. And in that div, I now want to check if we don't have a picked image, in which case I'll simply output a paragraph where I say no image picked yet, or something like that. But if we do have a picked image, I want to show that image. And for that, I'll use the image component provided by Next. So you should import that from Next image. And then here, on that image, I'll set the source to my picked image, so to that data URL, and the alt text to the image selected by the user. And I'll add that fill prop because I don't know the dimensions of that image in advance. And that should then be all. With that, we should have that finished image picker component, and we can now take a look at it. Here in this application, I now got this preview area. And if I now click this button, the file picker opens up. And if I pick an image, I can see that preview here. So that is working. And with that, we're now finally ready to also work on the submission of this form. So now that we got this form here, and we're able to pick images, it's time to make sure that this form can also be submitted, and that we then create and store a new meal when that happens. Now, when it comes to handling form submissions, we could do that as we do it in most React projects. We can go to the component that contains the form, and then we could add the onSubmit prop and define a function that should be executed when the form is submitted. There, we could then prevent the browser default, manually collect all the data, and send that data to a backend. But again, here we already are on the backend, at least kind of. We have a full stack application that has both backend and frontend. And that's why NextJS gives us a more powerful and convenient pattern than manually handling the form submission and collecting the data and sending it to a server. Instead, we can create a function in the component that holds the form, for example, which we could call share meal here, though the name is up to you. And we can then add a special directive in this function, so inside of this function body. And that's the use server directive. Now, we have seen the use client directive before, which, however, was not added inside of functions, but inside of files. And then, when added there, use client made sure that the components created in that file would be client components. Use server inside of a function is different, because this creates a so-called server action, which is a function that's guaranteed to execute on the server, and only there. So just as components, by default, are server components, which only execute on the server, this is now a function that only executes on a server. But in case of functions, you must explicitly state that it belongs to the server by adding this directive inside of them. if you want to create such a server action. In addition, to really turn this into a so-called server action, you also must add the async keyword in front of it. And now this is a server action. But what's now the special thing about this server action? Why does this feature exist? Well, this feature exists in React, by the way, not just in Next.js, but like server components, it doesn't really work in vanilla React apps. Instead, you need a framework like Next to unlock this feature and use it. And this feature then exists because you can now take such a server action and assign this server action function as a value for the action prop on a function. So here I'm setting share meal as a value on that action prop of that form here. And that's of course something you might have never seen before, because normally the action prop is set to the path to which the request should be sent if you're relying on the browser's built-in form handling capabilities. Now that's not what we're doing here. Instead, we're setting it to an action, to such a server action function. And that's a pattern that's supported by Next and React here that will ensure that when this form is submitted, Next.js will, behind the scenes, create a request and send it to this Next.js server that's serving the website, so that this function gets triggered and you can then handle the form submission there, but on the server. So that function will then execute on the server, not in the client. And this function will then automatically receive that form data that was submitted. So the data that was gathered by the inputs in the form, collected in a form data object, using that form data class that's available in JavaScript. So we'll get such a form data object here, and we can then use that to handle the submitted data. For example, here we could create a meal by extracting meal data from that form data. So we could add a title property to this meal, and as a value store form data get title. This form data object that we're getting will have a get method that allows us to get the value that was entered into a certain input field, and the input field is identified by its name. So if I get the value of the input field with the name title, I'm getting the value of this input field here, because this input field has that name title. And of course, we can now do that for all the data that makes up a meal. So all the data we're expecting in our database, like the image, the summary, the instructions, creator email, and so on. So for that here, we can also store the summary by getting hold of form data get summary, extracting the data from the input field with the name summary, get the instructions from form data get instructions, and get the image from form data get image. Now, for this to work, we have to make sure that we pass the appropriate name to our image picker component. And at the moment, I'm not doing that. Indeed, I'm using the image picker without setting either a label or a name. And I now want to change this. So here I'll set the label to your image and the name to image, let's say. And with that, we make sure that we can extract that image with help of form data get. Now that will then be the uploaded file and will handle the storage of that file a little bit later. Now besides that, I'll also get the creator of that meal by accessing form data get name, because I'm getting that name of the person who created that meal from that name input field. So with a name of name. So that's why I'm extracting it like this. And we get the creator email with help of form data get email. Like this. And therefore, that will give us that email. So with that, we create such a form object, and the next step then would be to store that in a database. Though the image should actually be stored on the file system, and then a path to that image should be stored in a database. But either way, the storage of this data is now the next step, but what's important to understand here is that you can use this server actions feature to create such a function that will be triggered when a form is submitted. And in order to see this in action, we'll not store that data yet, but instead simply log it to the console, like this. And with that, we can give this a try. If we now reload this share your email page, and I then enter some data here, like this, and I then also pick an image. If I click share meal, and I open the developer tools before doing that, you see no log here, but you also see that the page didn't reload. So it looks like that default browser behavior, which normally would be to send a request automatically and therefore reload the page, was prevented. And instead, you'll see some output here on the server side in your terminal. In that terminal where you started the development server. There you see that meal data. You see all the data I entered and that file. And again, we'll store that file soon. But with that, that's how you can handle form submissions with help of server actions. So this is how we can add a server action. There also is another way of adding it though. You can add it in a component like this, but this will only work if the component in which you are adding it is not a client component. If you had use client here at the top, because somewhere else in the component you might be using some client-only feature, you would get an error that you're not allowed to have server actions in a client component file. So that would be a problem then. Of course, here we don't need use client, though actually later we will need it, but at the moment we would be fine like this. But nonetheless, this would be a potential problem. In addition, you also might not want to have your server-side form submission handling logic in the same file as your JSX code. You might want to separate that. And for those reasons, you can also store server actions in separate files. Therefore here, I'll actually go back to that root lib folder and add a actions.js file in there, though the file name does not matter. It doesn't have to be named actions.js. It could be any name. What's important in that file though is that it has that use server directive at the top. So now not inside of a function, but instead at the top of a file. When adding it at the top of a file like this, all the functions you might define in that file will be treated as server actions. So that simply now allows us to go back to that share page and grab that share meal function here and cut it from there and instead move it into this actions file. There it now must be exported so that it can be used in other files. And you can and should now remove use server in here because we already got that at the top of the file. And with that server action outsourced here, we can now go back to the share meal page and still use it as an action here on the form by simply importing it. So by adding this import. And now you would be able to convert this to a client component if you needed to. Now you would not get an error when doing that. And that might sound strange, but the problem before was simply that you were defining client and server-side code in the same file. And the build process that's used by NextJS is essentially not able to separate that in a clean way. And therefore, server-side code could accidentally end up on the client side, which could pose security issues and cause other problems as well. That's why for technical reasons, you can't mix both in the same file, but you can absolutely import a server action from another file and then use it in such a client component. Again, here we don't need use client, but it is important to understand that you can blend these two worlds and mix these two worlds as I just described it. But with that, it's now finally time to make sure that we're not just logging the meal, but that we're actually storing it in a database. And that we store the image on the file system. So let's now work on storing that data. And to do that, I'll start in the meals.js file. Here we have functions for getting meals and getting a single meal. Now I want to export another function here, which is there to save a meal. And I expect a meal object as an input. A meal object that should have this shape here. Now inside of save meal, we therefore have to do a couple of things. For example, we'll need to generate a slug, because in my database I want to store a slug for every meal, and we don't get that from the form. Instead, I want to generate it based on the title. Now to do that, I'll stop the development server and install an extra package, a package called Slugify. That will do what its name implies. But that's not the only package I'll install. Instead, I'll also install a package called XSS, which will help us protect against cross-site scripting attacks. Because you must not forget that we're storing user-generated content, and I'm then outputting these instructions that are generated by the user as HTML. Here in that meal detail page, I'm outputting those instructions as HTML. So we are vulnerable to cross-site scripting attacks, and that's why we should protect against them and why we should sanitize the content that's sent by the user, which is exactly what we can do with help of this XSS package. So therefore now with that installed, we can restart the development server. And back here in meals.js, I now want to import these two packages. So Slugify from Slugify and XSS from XSS. Now let's start with the Slugify function. Here I'll create a new slug by calling Slugify and passing meal.title to it. In addition, I'll pass a configuration object to slug where I set lower to true so that it forces all characters to be lowercase. That's the first step. As a next step, I want to remove any harmful content from those instructions. And for that, we can use this XSS thing which we imported, which turns out to be a function, to call it on meal.instructions, so that we sanitize and clean those instructions. And actually, instead of using these extra constants or variables, we can of course also add a slug property to meal on the fly like this, and overwrite instructions with the sanitized instructions like this. Now with that done, we prepared all the data except for the image. Now the image should be stored on the file system, not in the database. Because storing files in databases is a bad idea. It's bad for performance because databases simply aren't built for that. Instead, I want to store the uploaded files in that public folder, because any images stored there, in that images folder, will be publicly available, so they can be rendered on the screen without problems. And therefore, we'll now need to perform a couple of steps. First, I'll start by getting the extension of the uploaded image, because it could be a JPEG or PNG file. So I'll dig into the meal image. Keep in mind that we're storing that image, which we got from the form, under that image key. So I'm getting access to that here. And then on that, I'll call split to split it on the dot and pop the last element, which will be the file extension. Next, I also want to generate a unique file name and not use the file name of the user. So therefore here, what I'll do is I'll generate a string with those backticks using that string template literal notation, which we can use in JavaScript, to create a file name that uses that slug here. So meal.slug actually, and then a dot, and then the extension. So now with that, we got the file name. Now we need to write that to a file in that public folder. And we can do that with help of an API provided by Node.js. To be precise, the file system API, and for that I'll import fs from node:fs. This allows us to work with the file system. We can then use this fs module to call createWriteStream, which will create a stream that allows us to write data to a certain file. Now createWriteStream then needs a path to the file to which you want to write, and it will then return a stream object which you can then use to write to that path. So regarding that path, I'll create a dynamic string here, and I'll target public/images. So this images folder here in this public folder, slash, and then the file name to which you want to write must be included in that path. So we can inject that file name here, this file name which we constructed earlier. With that, we then get a stream which we can store in a constant or variable and which we can use to write to that path, so to that image in that path. Now we can write to that stream by calling the write method on it. And this write method then wants a chunk. Now what's that chunk? In case of our image here, it means that we should convert the image to a so-called buffer, to a buffered image, you could say. Which might sound fancy, but which thankfully isn't too difficult to do. You can use that image object, which we have here, which we're getting from our form after all, so that image that's being stored under that image key. And that object has an array buffer method you can call, which will give you such a buffer, which we need here for the write method. The only tricky thing here is that array buffer actually will give you a promise that eventually resolves to that buffer, and therefore we must await this here. And in order to use await here, we should add async in front of the saveMeal function here. And with that, we then got this buffered image. Now this is of type array buffer, and write actually wants a regular buffer. So therefore here we have to call buffer from and pass this array buffer, so this buffered image, to it, like this. By the way, one other little error I just spotted is here, where I split my image name to get the extension. Here we have to access meal.image.name.split. Because meal.image is simply that image which we get from the form, so that image object that's automatically generated by the browser. And that object will indeed have a couple of helpful properties. One of them is the name property, which carries the name of the image file that was uploaded. So that's something we should change here. But with that, back to the stream. Now we're writing this buffer to this path, including this file. And this write method now also takes a second argument. The first argument is the thing you want to write. The second argument is a function that will be executed once it's done writing. And here we get an error argument, which is null if everything worked, but which will hold some error information if something went wrong. So therefore here we should check if error is truthy. So if we have an error, and in that case I want to throw a new error, where I say saving image failed, or something like this. And with that, we wrote the image to this file. Now we just need to store the overall data in the database. And for that, I'll start by overriding the image that's stored in my meal object with a path to the image where we stored it. Because I don't want to store the image file itself in a database, databases are not built for that. Instead, I just want to store the path. Hence, I'll override the image object in my meal with that path here, though there you should actually remove this public segment. Because all requests for images will be sent to the public folder automatically anyways, or put in other words, the content of the public folder will be served as if it were served on the root level of your server anyways, and therefore public shouldn't be included here, so that it won't be included later when requests for that image will be sent. But with that, we now finished the preparations for this meal object, and we can now save it in the database. And to save it, I'll use my DB object and then prepare another statement. And here I'll prepare a statement, and I'll use this template literal notation to split it across multiple lines, where I want to insert some data into the meals table, and I want to insert data into the following fields: into the title, into the summary field, into the instructions field, into the creator field and the creator email field, and into the image and slug fields. So basically into all fields that we configured when we created the table, except for the ID, because that will be populated automatically. Now we must specify the values that should be inserted into those fields. And here you could directly inject those values, but this is not recommended because that approach would be vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. Instead, you should use those placeholders, one for every field, though to make this a bit easier, you can also use another syntax here, supported by better SQLite, which I also used in the initdb.js file. This syntax here. You can target specific fields by their name, like this, and then later just pass an object to the run function, which we will call on this prepared statement, and better SQLite, the package we're using to execute this command here, will then look at those property names in that object you're passing to it to extract the values stored under those property names, and it will then use those values to store them in those fields. However, you must make sure that the order you got here is the same as you have it here, and therefore I'll reorder that and put title first, then the summary, then the instructions, then the creator email, and then the image and the slug. I also will remove that trailing comma and instead add one here. Getting those commas right is really important. You will get errors if you don't do it. Well, and then we can call run on that statement and pass our meal object to it. And thanks to this syntax we're using here, the data for those fields will automatically be extracted. And that's it then. This is a save meal function that will store both a file and the data in the database. With that done, we can go back to our server action, and there, instead of console logging that meal, we can call save meal. So we can call this function on which we just worked. Now save meal will return a promise, so we can also add async here, and then use a wait here. Though at the moment I then don't have any follow-up action that should be executed here, but that will come later. With that though, we're making sure to call save meal here in the server action. Therefore now we should pass the meal to save meal. And if we now save everything and you got that development server up and running, if you go to that share meal page, you should be able to enter some data here, like this, and then pick an image, and click share meal. And with that, nothing happens here, which is a good sign. At least we got no error, but of course, we also don't know whether it worked. Now, we'll take care of that in a second. For the moment, we can take a look at the public folder, and there indeed, I find my uploaded image. So that's a good hint that it seemed to have worked. I also got no error here in my terminal. And if we go back to the page and browse our meals again, we should also find our meal here. And that therefore proves that it did work. Now, to provide a better user experience, we might want to redirect the user once the meal data has been submitted. And for that, we can go back to our actions, and here after save meal, we can call redirect and import that from next navigation. This redirect function will do what its name implies. It will redirect the user to a different page. For that, you have to pass a path to redirect, and that of course should be the path of the page you want to redirect the user to. So for example, to /meals. With that added, if we reload our page here maybe, and browse all those meals that we got there, and I then add a new meal, and here I'll just quickly enter some dummy data to save some time. I'll use the same image though, because we'll use the title as a slug for the image name on the server anyways, so we won't overwrite the old image. But if I do all that and I then click share meal, initially still nothing happens. We'll take care of that soon, but after a short while, we are redirected. And I see my new meal here. So that all works. So now that we're able to save meals, it's time to further enhance the user experience here. And for example, as you saw before, it takes quite some time until we are redirected after adding our data. Now that will typically be a bit faster in production, but still, it would be nice to get some feedback as a user whilst the data is being submitted to see that everything's fine and a request is on its way. So it would be nice to, for example, update this button once we clicked it to tell us that the request is on its way. And to do that, we can use another hook provided by React. Yes, React, but again, a feature that really only works when using Next. For that, I'll go back to my share page here, where I have that form. And here, I want to conditionally update this button and, for example, show the text submitting when the request is on its way. And we can achieve this by using another special hook called useFormStatus. And this hook must be imported, useFormStatus, from React-DOM. So not from React, not from Next.js, but from React-DOM. And this then gives you a status object, which, for example, has a pending property, which is true if there is an ongoing request and false otherwise. However, if you add that hook, you'll see that you'll get an error, because this hook requires a client component in order to work. Which makes sense because it is about updating the client-side UI based on any ongoing requests. Now, therefore, we would have to add useClient here. And we could do that. Wouldn't be a problem, everything would work. But we also might not want to turn this entire page into a client component just because we want to conditionally update this button. In addition, this hook here will actually only give us the status of a form if it's inside of that form for which it should give us the status. So it must be inside of this form here if we want to get the submission status of that form. And with inside this form, I mean inside of some component that's inside of that form. So it wouldn't work here anyways. And therefore, I will not add it here, and therefore remove it, and instead add a new component. A new component here in the meals folder, in the components folder, let's say, that could be named meals form submit or anything like this. And I'll export a component function here which I'll name meals form submit. In this file, I'll then import this use form status hook, and I'll add that client directive. And then we can get our status here by calling use form status like this. Now, as mentioned, this status thing here is an object with various properties, and therefore we can actually use object destructuring here to pull out that one property I'm interested in here. And that's the pending property. Well, and then meals form submit should return a button which says share meal. So what I had on this button here before as well. But actually it shouldn't always say that. Instead, I want to output some conditional content here and check if pending is truthy, in which case I want to output the text submitting, and otherwise I'll output the text share meal. In addition, I want to disable the button if we are submitting. So I'll set the disabled prop to pending, so that we do disable the button if the surrounding form is being submitted, and we enable it if that's not the case. And with that, we can go back to our form and replace this vanilla button here with our meals form submit button, this component we just worked on. With that done, if I reload this page, I can again enter some data here. Like this, and pick the same image as before. And if I click share meal, you now see this button changes, and therefore we get a better feedback. And then after a while, we're redirected and we see our new meal here. So that's better. So we're already providing better user feedback. But that's not all we should do here. One other thing you should typically do when handling user data and form submissions is validate the values you're getting. And at the moment, we're not performing any validation at all in our server action here. Now, we do have some validation because in that form, I'm using those built-in special attributes, those required props here to be precise, to make sure that we can't submit an empty form. So if I press submit here, I'm getting some errors automatically by the browser. And that's a useful behavior, but it's not enough. Because I can disable that by going to the DevTools and removing that. Now, of course, many users won't know about that, but some do, and in that case, those users could submit invalid values to my backend. Because now I would not get an error for this field anymore. And that's why client-side validation isn't enough. Instead, you should also validate on the server side. And here you can now, of course, set up some very complex validation rules. You can use a third-party package that helps you with that. I'll keep it fairly simple to not waste your time, but it's important to know that you should do that in your applications. So here we could, for example, check if meal.title, once we trim it to remove excess whitespace on the left and right, we could check if that's then equal to an empty string, which would mean that it's an invalid value. We could also check if meal title maybe even doesn't exist. So if it's falsy, so if it wasn't part of the submitted data at all. And therefore here we would now make it into this if block if we either don't have a title or if we have one but it's empty. And you should now probably do that for all those fields. And therefore here I'll actually add a helper function, is invalid text, could be a fitting name, where I expect to get some text and where I return the result of this check. So that I return true if the text we got is either falsy or it's an empty string after trimming it. And now I can use isInvalidText down here and check if meal.title is an invalid text, or if meal.summary is an invalid text, and so on. We can now relatively easily do that for all those fields. So also do it for the instructions, for the creator, and also for the creator email. And of course, that should be meal.instructions, meal.creator, and meal.creator email. And we also might want to check whether that maybe exists but is an invalid email address. So I'll also check if meal.creator email does not include an @ symbol by adding an exclamation mark here at the beginning. So if the email does not include an @ symbol, we also make it into this if block. And last but not least, I want to check the image that we got. I want to check if maybe we don't have an image, so if it's undefined, or if that image here has a size that's equal to 0, which means it's some kind of invalid file. And in all those cases, I want to make it into this if block, and then do what? Well, then we could throw an error. So we could throw an error where we say invalid input. And by doing that, if you save that, you ensure that if you reload here, and you then enter values into all those fields except the email address, and we then get rid of the required attribute on that email field so that we can submit it. If we do all that, you see I get this error page. Now the error message here is a bit misleading because it's that main error page which we set up earlier. We should probably set up a specific error page for sharing a meal. So I will copy that here, paste it here, and say failed to create meal. That sounds better. But the important thing is that we got some error at all. However, that's just one way of handling this. Throwing an error, as we do it here, works, but it also means that we destroy the entire input of the user. So we throw away everything they entered. And that's not necessarily a great user experience. It would be better if we would stay on this page and just output some error message somewhere on this page, above the form or below the form, for example. And that's therefore what we'll implement next. So how can we handle validation errors like this in a more elegant way? Well, in server actions, as we have it here, you're not limited to redirecting or throwing errors. Instead, you can also return values. You can return response objects, to be precise. And I'll show you how to access those objects in your components in just a second. So here we could return an object, which maybe has a message field, which holds a value of invalid input. Though the shape of this object is totally up to you, it's just important that it's a serializable object, which means it, for example, shouldn't include any methods, because those would get lost whilst being sent to the client. But any simple values like strings, numbers, nested objects, or nested arrays, those values all work. So that's how we can return a response. How can we then use that response in that share page where we trigger that server action? Well, we can use it with help of another hook. Another hook provided by React DOM. The useFormState hook. So not useFormStatus, which we had before, but useFormState. Sounds similar, but is a different hook. This hook also must be imported from React DOM, like this. And then this hook here works a little bit like the use state hook that's built into React. Because this hook is responsible for managing the state of this page or of this component, which uses a form that will be submitted with help of server actions. And that's precisely the use case where useFormState can help you. Because useFormState needs two arguments, and the first argument is the actual server action that should be triggered when the form is submitted. In this case, share meal. The second argument you pass to useFormState is the initial state of this component. And that simply means the initial value that should be returned by useFormState before this action has been triggered and yielded a response. So the initial value that should be used if we haven't received a response from this action yet. And that could be anything you want, for example null, or an object where you have a message field that holds a value of null, to resemble the shape of that response we will eventually send back. Eventually I'll send back an object with this shape, where the message holds a string, so our initial value here could be the same shape, but null as a value for the message. Then useFormState will give you an array with exactly two elements, which might sound familiar because the default useState hook provided by React also gives you two elements. And indeed here, the two elements we get here are kind of similar to the two elements we get from useState. Because we get the current state, the current response, you could say, of this page here, of this component here. So the latest response returned by this server action in the end, or this initial state if no response has been received yet. And we get another form action here, which we should actually set as a value for this action prop on the form now. So instead of setting share meal as a value for action down here, I'm now setting this form action, which I'm getting back from useFormState, as a value for the action down there. And this must be done so that useFormState can basically step in and manage that state for this component. And that state depends on the execution of that server action and its response. And that's why useFormState kind of needs to act as a man in the middle, you could say. With that, we can then use this state here, which will essentially be either this here or any response we got back from share meal, to output data in this component. Now in this case, I know that state will therefore either be an object with a message that's a string, or it'll be an object with a message that's null. So we can use it down here at the end of the form, right before the submit button, let's say, to output an error message. For that, we can check if state.message is truthy, which means we have a message. And in that case, I want to output it here between my paragraph tags. Now with that, we also need to tweak the share meal action though, because when passing it as a value to useFormState, it must have a different shape than it did before. It should no longer just accept that form data. Instead, it should now actually accept two parameters, because useFormState will pass two parameters to sharemeal when it executes it when the form gets submitted. The second parameter will still be that submitted data, but the first parameter will be the previous state. So either that initial state that we set up here, or any other previous responses that might have been generated. I don't care about it here, but still we need to accept it because form data is now the second argument we get, not the first. With that though, we got everything set up that needs to be set up, but we'll now get an error if we try to load the page. Because useFormState since it in the end again deals with updating the client, needs to be executed in a client component. And therefore, we should add use client here in our share meal page component file. We could again try to outsource this into some nested component, but here I'll stick to this component, add use client, and save that. And with that, this is looking good. We got no error, and therefore now we can try submitting an invalid form again. So here I'll enter some data like this, and if I now inspect my email field and I remove the required prop here and I click share meal, I now get this error message. Now, of course, we could make it pop more. We could make sure that it stands out, that it's more descriptive, and you can do all these things. You can, for example, tweak that message here, which in the end is the message that's showing up on the screen. But the main takeaway is that this is how you can show such an error message. That you can return responses in your server actions, and that you can get and handle them with help of the useForm state hook. So sharing meals works now, but there actually is one problem with our application. Everything works fine here during development, when using that development server. But things will change once we move to production. Now, to move from development to production, we should quit that development server here and then run another script in the terminal, navigate it into our project folder still. And that's the npm run build script. This will build and prepare our NextJS application for production. It will essentially give us a project that we could then deploy onto a server. Now you can run that production server and that optimized code by then running npm start. So first npm run build and then thereafter npm start. This will start a server, but now not some development server, but instead the production server, which here is still served under the same address, but now it's serving that optimized code and so on. Now, therefore, you can revisit localhost 3000 and you should, for example, still see your meals there. But you'll now notice something strange when you add a new meal. For that, here, I'll again going to enter some data, and I'll name my meal Tasty Bruschetta. Very delicious. Add my instructions, like this, and pick the same image as always. If I now click Share Meal, I'm redirected, and this is now quicker. As I mentioned before, that's great, it's quicker, better user experience. But the meal is missing here. I see the 3 meals I submitted before, but this new meal is missing. Keep in mind that I added a text of very delicious to it, and I don't see that text anywhere here. And there's one other thing that's pretty strange here on this site. If I go back to the starting page, for example, and I reload and I then go to browse meals, I'm there pretty much instantly. If I'm on this page and I reload, it also reloads pretty much instantly. You might recall that before, this took 5 seconds because I added this extra delay here in the meals.js file, this delay. Why is this missing here in production? And why is this meal we added missing? Well, because as mentioned earlier in this section, NextJS performs some pretty aggressive caching. And there is one extra step it performs and goes through when preparing the app for production that we didn't see when testing it with the development server. Because when you run this npm run build command to prepare the app for production, NextJS goes ahead and actually generates, pre-renders all the pages of your app that can be pre-generated. So basically all non-dynamic pages. So it, for example, pre-generated the meals page. So this page.js file in the meals folder. This page here, which outputs some meals, it was pre-generated. So all that data was fetched and rendered there during the build process. And Next.js is doing that because by pre-rendering all these pages, it of course has those pages available right from the start after being deployed. And so the very first visitor of your website is able to instantly see the finished page without having to wait for anything to render, which of course can be a great user experience. And Next.js then caches those pre-rendered pages so that it's able to serve them to all visitors. But the downside of this approach, of course, is that it never refetches the meals, because this code here never executes again. Instead, it just uses those pre-generated pages. And I can prove that. We can simply console log fetching meals here in that meals component that's being used by the meals page. And if I do that, and I then rebuild my project by running npm run build again, you will see that it generates all those pages. And then once it's done, if I start that production server, if I reload the meals page, I don't see fetching meals here. I get some warning that we might want to install some extra package when using that image component, but we can't ignore that here. The main thing is that we don't see this message being logged. So that is not executing anymore because those pages were pre-generated and cached. But that's of course a problem if the data that's visible on that page changes, as it's the case for me here. Now you can see that latest meal I added earlier now because I regenerated all the pages. But if I would add another new meal here, it would again be missing. And that's of course absolutely not the behavior we want here. So how can we fix this problem of Next.js caching too aggressively? Well, we need to tell Next.js to throw away its cache or parts of its cache whenever we add a new meal. And of course, this is such a common requirement that there's a built-in method for that, a built-in function provided by Next.js. A function which I want to execute in my server action right after saving a meal before I redirect. And that function is called reValidatePath. This function tells Next.js to revalidate the cache that belongs to a certain route path. So for example, if I know that I want to visit the meals page and that the meals page depends on data that changed now, I can tell Next.js to revalidate the /meals path. And with that path would be revalidated. Now what's important is that by default, only that path will be revalidated, no nested paths. So if I had some nested path there in my meals folder that also depends on all the meals data, I would have to revalidate that separately. Alternatively, you can pass a second argument to revalidate path and set this to layout. The default is page, which means that simply this one page for this one path will be revalidated. If you set it to layout, it's the layout that will be revalidated, which, as you learned, also wraps nested pages, and therefore with this, all nested pages would be revalidated as well. And revalidate simply means that Next.js throws away the cache that is associated with those pages. So, for example, the cached pages themselves. Now here I don't care about any nested pages, because the dynamic page here isn't pre-generated anyways in our current setup. And the share page doesn't depend on the meals data, so I'm fine with just revalidating /meals. If you would want to revalidate all the pages of your entire website, you could, by the way, do that by targeting / and then setting the mode to layout. But here I'm fine with just revalidating the meals path. Well, and with that done, if we now run npm run build again to build all those pages again, they will still be pre-generated and cached, but now that cache should be revalidated and partially cleared once we added a new meal. So if I now run npm start again to start that development server, and I then add another new meal, like this, picking the same image as always. If I submit that, it takes a bit longer here, which is a good sign because it's taking longer because it loaded all those meals again. And here we are. Now the image is missing. We'll take care of that in just a second, but the meal is there. And that's of course a good sign. In addition, we got these fetching meals logs back here, which also proves that this is now working as intended. So now that we understood how caching worked and we fixed that problem related to it, let's focus on that missing image. Why was that image missing when we added a new meal whilst running this production server? Well, the image was missing because we store those images in this public folder and they're in the images folder. The problem with this approach just is that this folder is available during development, but for production, it's actually copied into this .next folder, and it's this .next folder, which also contains all those cached pages and so on, that will be used by the running NextJS production server. If you then thereafter add new images into the public folder, those will be ignored because the production server doesn't care. So when you deploy your next project, you therefore technically don't even have to deploy the public folder. NextJS is not interested in it. Now that's of course a problem for our app here, because we do store images in that public folder. Well, this behavior is described in the official NextJS documentation, and there they therefore recommend that you should store any files that are generated at runtime, essentially, using extra file storage services like AWS S3. Now, since working with a provider like S3 is now really a bit beyond the scope of this course, we'll ignore this problem here. However, after this lecture, in the next lecture, you'll find a text lecture where I do describe how you could use AWS S3 for storing and serving your user-generated images. You don't have to implement that, you can ignore it for this demo, but if you're interested in learning how that would work, that next lecture is for you. All that, we're now finally pretty much done with this application here. Now, I will quickly fix a styling error, which I only just detected, which has been fixed in the attachments I provided to you though. So you already got the right styles earlier, but here I'll fix it by moving position relative in the meal item.module CSS file from this meal header selector to the image selector. Again, I did already fix that in the attachments I provided to you. So you don't have to do anything and you got the right styles all the time already. But now here, for me, those meals also look a bit better. But that's just one thing. The more important last step I want to go through together with you is the page metadata that you can add to your pages. And you can see that in the root layout.js file. There we have a metadata constant that's being exported. And that's not some random constant, but instead NextJS is looking for exported variables or constants called metadata in all your page or layout files. And then in this metadata object, you can set some metadata fields, which is also described in the official documentation. There you can find details about all the fields you can set on this metadata object, and attached you find a link to this documentation, so that you can explore in depth which fields can be set there. In short, this metadata constant allows you to add a bunch of metadata, which is then, for example, exposed to search engine crawlers, or which shows up when you're sharing a link to a page on X or Facebook. Now here I'll keep it fairly simple, but I want to add a title and description to every page. Now if you add this metadata to a layout, it will automatically be added to all the pages that are wrapped by that layout, unless a page specifies its own metadata. In that case, the page metadata wins. Any nested layout metadata would also win over that root layout metadata. But by setting this metadata here, every page will at least have this basic metadata. But now, of course, I want to set more specific metadata for some of my pages. For example, for that all meals page. There, it would be nice to have some metadata, and we can therefore add it by simply exporting this metadata constant there as well. And then here we could set the title to all meals, and then maybe add a description of browse the delicious meals shared by our vibrant community. Something like this. If you do that, and you go to that meals page, you'll see that if you reload, you have this all meals title here. And if you take a look at the page source, you will also find this description meta tag in there, which contains your description text as content. Here it is. So that's how you can add metadata. But how can you add metadata to dynamic pages, where the title and the description depends on the concrete data that has been loaded? Adding static metadata like this typically doesn't do the trick there. For dynamic pages, you can add metadata by not exporting a constant or variable named metadata, but by instead exporting an async function called generate metadata. And it must be called like this because NextJS is also looking for functions like this. If it doesn't find any other metadata, it's checking whether there is such a function. And if there is such a function, NextJS will execute it for you. And then it's your job to return such a metadata object in that function. Now, how does that help us with dynamic data? Well, this function receives the same data our page component receives as props. So here we also get an object with a params key. And that, of course, allows us to get the meal for which the metadata should be generated by simply accessing meal slug and passing that to getMeal. Well, and with that, we can then return a title that's set equal to meal title and a description that's set to meal.summary, for example. And that's how we can generate the metadata for a dynamic page. With that, if we now visit a meal, we can see its title, its name, represented here in the tab title. Now, if we enter some invalid slug here, we now get an error though, instead of the not found page. Because the metadata is actually generated first, and this now simply fails. When I try to access title on meal, that fails because meal is undefined. So therefore, we should actually add this if check here, where we check whether the meal is maybe not defined, and call the not found function if it isn't, inside of generate metadata, to ensure that we show the not found page if generating the metadata fails, which it does if we don't find that meal. With that, you see that now we get that meal not found page again. But that's how we can handle that metadata. And that's now it for this section. In this section, we had an in-depth look into Next.js using this app router. And you learned how you can set up routes by using the file system inside of app and by using these special file names like page.js and layout.js. You also learned about other special files like error.js for handling errors or notfound.js for handling not found errors. Or the loading.js file, which I'm not using here, but which we used temporarily to show some loading state on the screen. Though you learned that you have more granular control by using suspense, which is what we then did. Now you also learned how to configure dynamic routes, where some path segments aren't known in advance, like here, where we load pages for individual meals, where we don't know in advance how many meals we'll have. And most importantly, you learned that all those pages in the end just export standard React components, but that those components are kind of special when using Next.js. That they are server components that are executed on the server, that are rendered on the server, therefore. And it's not just those page components, but instead all components, unless you explicitly opt out of this behavior by adding this useClient directive to convert a file and its components into a client component, which then is rendered on the client, and which then therefore may use client-side functionality like useState or handling user events. You therefore also learned that you can take advantage of those server components by fetching data directly inside of those components. There is no need to use useEffect and send requests to separate backends. Instead, you can fetch the data from right inside your server components. And you can not just fetch the data. You also learned about server actions. Async functions that either have the useServer directive inside of them or that are stored in a file with useServer at the top. And the special thing about those server actions is that you can assign them as values to the action prop on form elements, either directly or, as we're doing it here, with help of useFormState, which is a hook provided by React DOM to handle responses returned by the server action function and then potentially update the UI based on those responses. Like here, where we're conditionally showing an error message. Speaking of updating the UI based on server actions, you also learned about the useFormStatus hook, which can be used to find out whether a form is currently being submitted or not, which can then be used to update the UI accordingly. Now, related to all of that, you also learned that Next.js does some pretty aggressive caching, and that therefore you should call revalidatePath whenever you change some data to make sure that the latest data is fetched and represented on your pages. And you also saw that it can be dangerous if you never test your app in production mode, because everything worked in development mode in our app here, but then suddenly the data was missing in production mode. So this is an important function and an important concept to understand in general. Now, last but not least, we also talked about metadata that can be added to pages, static metadata, as we have it here, or dynamically generated metadata. And therefore, at this point, you have a super solid Next.js foundation, and you're ready to use Next.js with its app router in your future projects.